Hello and good evening. Tonight's gentle journey takes us to when did people start smoking weed? Lower the volume, rest your eyes, and let the past be your lullaby. If this brings you peace, consider liking and subscribing only if it truly helps. And share in the comments where you're joining us from and the hour there. Now, lights down, a soft fan if you have one, and let's begin our walk through history. We'll begin at the oldest edge of memory, where firelight licks a stone and winter presses close. This is a story not only of a smoke, but of rope and paper, of seed and song, a small plant walking beside us as we learn to build, to bury, to pray. Across ancient rivers and grasslands, people reached for the same stalk for work, and almost by accident found a second purpose curled in its resin. Tonight, we follow that first breath, the one that made the ordinary feel briefly extraordinary, and trace how it traveled from campfires to courts, from tents to temples. Keep your breath even. Let the centuries step softly. We begin not with a conqueror or a philosopher, but with a plant that kept finding its way into human hands long before we knew what to call it. 5,000 years before common calendars, when cold wind braided through Eurasian grasslands and sparks flew from damp kindling, someone tossed dried cannabis on a coal to sweeten the smoke or chase insects from a sleeping mat. The air thickened, a breath went in, the world tilted half a degree. There was no word for it, only a sense that time had thickened. Archaeologists will later sift graves and hearth dumps and draw out small, stubborn seeds, some blistered by flame, some tucked against traces of fabric. We read these mute tokens like whether people laid the plant with their dead because it mattered to the living. A pouch in a palm, a scatter near the ribs, a twist of cord beside a skull. Whether talisman or provision, it had earned a place in the last inventory a family kept for someone they loved. Before smoke, there was rope. Hemp's first gifts were tactile and obvious. Stalks split cleanly under the thumbnail, fibers teased out in ribbons, bundles soaked in ponds to slip the pith from the strength. Soon the village was stitched with it. Nets that met the river like patient hands, sandals that outlasted seasons, cloth that did not sulk in rain, a beam bound with hemp shrugged off winter, a thatch tied with it slept tighter in the wind. Seeds, too, made their argument, toasted on hot stone. They fed a child, pounded into paste. They thickened stews and brightened the hungry weeks. Oil pressed from them lamped the dusk. So a family could be wrapped in this plant, eat it, wear it, fish with it, write on it, even pay a debt with a skein of its fiber. That is the first truth cannabis served before it sang. It was nature's hard-working multi-tool long before it was anyone's escape. And yet intention circles back to accident. The same bundles that smoldered for pests also carried resin that wakes when heated. On a thawing dawn, a storyteller leaned in, drawing the smoke that hung under a hide roof. What followed was not revelation, but a shift in attentiveness. The log's pop seemed polite. The child's breathing settled. A mind that usually kept one eye on wolves and another on weather took, for a fenced interval, a gentler stance toward the world. They wouldn't have named it at all, only noticed the change. In that ingenious epoch we call the Stone Age, settlements gathered by rivers and pottery fattened into useful bellies. People learned where hemp lush to stand field edges and ditch banks where water lingered and began helping it along. Seeds were saved from the kindest stalks, the ones that split cleanly. A corridor of domestication opened across the grasslands, and with it, a companionship. We gave the plant room, it gave us time. The graves tell us the meaning kept doubling. A tool became a symbol without ceasing to be a tool. In one place, a coil of cord suggests a craft. In another, a handful of seeds whispers companionship for the long road. We can imagine mourners in a long dusk, food for the journey, a blade that kept its edge, and a small bundle of dried leaves that had turned many cold nights kinder. To send someone into the ground with cannabis was to admit that this plant marked life's measures: workday, mealtime, wake, and rest, and that the dead should not step into the next weather without it. Knowledge rarely starts in one blaze, along northern forests that blurred into steppe, in pockets now mapped as Siberia and Mongolia, at river joints in today's Xinjiang. The same lesson ripened again and again. Smoke can soften the inside weather. Communities began to keep moments for it. The hearth was stoked for more smoke than flame. A seam was covered to hold the air. An elder watched that no coal jumped where it shouldn't. A word or a gesture marked the crossing from labor to witness. If a modern listener asks, did they truly smoke weed? The answer is yes, and also wider. Inhalation was one avenue among several. Leaves and seeds could be eaten. Oils rubbed into sore joints, a tonic brewed. But breathing warmed smoke into the chest. Letting the plant meet the blood quickly was discovered early, because fire was always there and curiosity is a human constant. They would not have separated sacred from secular as we do. A thing that eased grief could steady a hunter. A thing that soothed panic could make a winter story deeper. Use was not one lane, but a braided path. Part of the plant's genius is its willingness to travel. People carried it the way they carried a good campsite in mind. Seeds rode in pouches and in mud on sandals. A guest departing at dawn left a coil of cord and a few seeds as thanks. A host showed where the ditch held water the longest. With each season, cannabis stitched new hamlets into its quiet republic of fiber and smoke. It did not conquer, it insinuated by utility, by solace, by the simple act of making a cold night bearable. So before the word weed, before edicts and markets, before poets and laws, there is this ordinary miracle: a plant and a people learning each other's language. The plant offers tensile strength, nourishment, and a scent that changes how evening sits inside you. People offer soil, shelter, and the promise to remember which stalks were kindest. In that pact, humanity did not meet a vice, it met a companion. What followed empires, scriptures, experiments, crackdowns belongs to later chapters. Here at the start, the scene holds cold air and a low fire, a bundle laid on embers, the shift of breath that makes a crowded mind step back half a pace. Rope coils by the door, a net dries on a peg, a pouch of seeds waits by a bowl. Outside, the wind writes long lines across the grass. Inside, someone watches the smoke rise and, just for a moment, finds the world easier to carry. China meets our smoke with a measuring spoon and a notebook. In the half-legendary dawn of its pharmacopoeia, the divine farmer Shenong walks ridge and field, tasting leaves and saps, then noting what they do to the body. Observation becomes ritual. Try, notice, record. Cannabis enters his ledger as medicine, first cooling, easing, persuading aches to let go, and only much later as anything like an intoxicant. Imagine him, as the story tells it, a man who can watch herbs travel his channels. He tastes too much, becomes ill, and tastes again. The lesson is continuity. From that discipline, a classic ripens, sorting plants by natures and flavors, warm and cool, pungent and sweet tonics for long years and powders for short nights. Cannabis sits among the helpfuls for pain, nagging fevers, fretful sleep, and what physicians call wind that rattles joints and unsettles spirit. The character that scribes use, ma, is a drawing as much as a word, a roof line, and beneath it the drooping fronds stalks hung to dry in a shed. Speak it, and the tone rises and falls like a shuttle through warp. In the mouth you hear the history, a work sound, domestic, stored for later. Before it is a smoke, ma is a task. By the time kingdoms argue in bronze, hemp has gone everywhere a hand can go. Fibers split obediently under a knife and comb into pale hair. Women at riverbanks ret the stalks. Men twist line for nets and ferry ropes. Children judge a good stem by its shine. Thatch, tied with it, sleeps tight in wind. The home becomes a catalogue of small strengths. When you needed a knot that kept its temper, you reached for hemp. Ink enters the story before polished paper becomes an imperial standard. Hemp rag and bark yield mats and pulps that take a mark and keep it. A brush lifts from a sheet with a soft sound. In that sound is the future records that outlast damp seasons, accounts that survive their keepers. The bureaucracy that will one day make careful hills of paper begins here, in fibers that resist rot and accept ink with a steady grain. In the clinic, where bamboo blinds cool the light and a kettle speaks on low flame. Cannabis is a shelf mate to ginger, ephedra, and ginseng, not an outlaw, a citizen of the cupboard. The doctor writes with a soft brush and measures with a scale that remembers what each gram should feel like. The herb is ground, infused, swallowed. Relief comes not as a journey, but as a chair made more comfortable. Physicians tend balance as if balance were a hearth. Too much heat climbs, too much cold sinks. Wind moves restlessly. Dampness lingers like an uninvited guest. Cannabis, in their language, can disperse and settle, soften and open an herb whose virtue lies in coaxing a clenched door in the body to unfasten. It joins a grammar of pulses and patterns, where the wrist reports the weather and the tongue tells how the fields inside have fared this season. Do not imagine a solemn nation that never smiled at its medicine people or people, but the tone is procedural. You boil, measure, strain. You recite doses the way a boatman recites bends in a river. A favorite restorative might be wind in the bones decoction, gone to milk with seed and leaf, a comfort that moves through the body like warm conversation. Even pleasure, when it appears, is noted how long it lasts, what it does for sleep, whether appetite returns on time. Outside, the fields keep their own account. Hemp rows stand like green handwriting across embankments. In the spinning courtyards, fingers draw fiber from retted stalks and lay it with patience onto spindles. The thread has a dignified roughness. It makes cloth that does not mind a sweat, rope that forgives rain. Floods come, but nets are ready. Winters lengthen, but sandals do not dissolve. Everywhere the eye falls. Ma repeats in thatch ties, in the rope that holds a sluice gate. in wicks that drink lamp oil, in the paper that records a clerk's decision about land and lineage. A traveler could trace its presence through market towns, as a single thread pulled through garments a man carrying skeins, a woman selling seed cakes, a boy with a coil looped across his chest like a tame snake. The plant is not exotic, it is a neighbor, and yet the other capacity, the one that will trouble poets and magistrates for 3 millennia, waits in the resin. Warm it, and it rises to meet the head. Early writers acknowledge this with a light, bureaucratic touch worth noting, worth regulating, not worth centering. The register of uses remains practical relief of pain that makes work impossible, easing of spasms that mock dignity, calming of spirits when grief knocks the mind off its bench. Administration, not indulgence, is the point. From time to time, a ritualist borrows it for an evening, a grain in incense, a pinch in a pill for augury, where breath slows and the ear is trained to quiet patterns. But that belongs to another room in this same house and will earn its chapter later. Here, the emphasis is companionship at scale, a plant yoked to the ordinary, to looms and ledgers, and the hour just before dawn, when the fever finally relents. We call cultures ancient as if they were far away. Listen instead to the sentences doctors leave in their manuals. Begin with observation, continue with method, end with modesty. Try this. If it helps, continue. If it harms, stop. You hear the same caution in the fields harvest after the dew lifts. Soak bundles in running water, comb fibers with even hands, twist with your breath. One temperament care drawn out into work. There are no saints in this chapter, only workers. To see how a civilization hides its genius in plain sight, watch a woman soften hemp in a basin while humming a tune her grandmother used. That cloth may wrap a ledger, a newborn, a parcel of dried mushrooms for winter. That rope may hold a fairy, a door, a memory. So China's entry in the Cannabis Chronicle is not a trumpet call, but a ledger line carried beneath the melody. The plant is domesticated, documented, deployed. It feeds lamps and stomachs. It takes ink. It gives up fiber without complaint. And when asked carefully, it lends comfort to bodies that have labored long. If other peoples will step into tents to meet their gods in a rush of smoke, China will make a list, keep it, and improve it until relief becomes repeatable and a storage becomes culture. Later, other rooms will open caves where incense thickens into visions, altars where questions meet answers in perfumed air, debates where stern men warn that easy minds make weak states. Those are real, and they're coming. For now, stay with the clerk's hand, the farmer's row, the physician's measure. In the age before fireworks, the genius is already bright to take a wild stalk and make it standard, to turn a smoke into remedy, resin into civility, and a plant into the neighbor you nod to every morning. The grasslands teach a different grammar of ceremony, no walls, only horizon, no altar, only sky, no incense, only what the earth gives when warmed. Here, in the wide-shouldered steppe that runs from the Black Sea toward Mongolia, the people Herodotus would call Scythians learned to turn a smoke into a doorway. The wind carries heat away fast in this country. You must trap it, coax it, hold it. So they made a tent for grief and for joy. And in that darkness, with the stones blazing and seeds on the coals, they let breath join breath until the world swayed and steadied again. Herodotus, the tireless collector of other people's customs, describes a scene like this in his Book of Travels: a small felt structure sealed tight, a pan of red-hot stones, hemp seeds cast upon them, and then the howling pleasure, he says, a word that wants to be bracketed by ceremony here, because it is not only delight, but release. His sentence is spare. The step fills the rest. In that pocket of air, vapor rises sweet and blue. The throat accepts it first as heat, then as a change in the chiming of thoughts. The body, accustomed to the straight road of daily caution, finds a side path and takes it. The people who walked into these tents were riders and archers, traders and raiders, mothers who could rope a colt and youths who could skin a goat by moonlight. They wore their stories on their skin ink, roped into animals along forearms and ribs, antlers running like rivers, cats and birds knotted together as if the whole world were a chase that never ended. They lived under felt roofs, but their roof of roofs was the weather. For them, smoke was not indulgence. It was tool and theater to cool a fevered mind, to speak with the newly dead, to return the heart to its proper beat. Grief brings a people to invention. When a warrior died, or a matriarch who kept the camp in her mind like a map, the living built a yurt of mourning. Stones were heated in a pit until they glowed like coins. Inside, skins were hung to hold the air. Outside, horses stamped and blew as if they, too, were called. The mourners entered in twos and threes, stooping. A woman carried a small pouch. A man carried a wooden bowl. No one spoke at first. The door flaps sank, and the dark became a body. Then the work, the calm, rehearsed work began. Hemp seed onto the stones, a hiss like a secret, the steam rising fast. Someone fanned with a board to push the rush outward. Someone else whispered the first name. Heat pressed at the scalp, the smoke soft as cloth. There's always a moment when breath argues, and then it yields. The dead person's deeds were recited in short, bright phrases: the horse he saved from the river eyes, the child she kept alive in the bad winter, the road they found by the taste of the grass. The smoke stitched the memories together until the chest loosened and the mouth could laugh without betraying sorrow. Outside, the wind scraped the tent. Inside, time bent, and the old voices could be heard for a little while longer. They did this not once, but many times after burial. On the day the grave mound hardened, when the first snow fell, when the first foal came, in kurgans, those high stony tumuli that still rise like speech marks across the grass. Archaeologists would later find the evidence of these people's priorities: wood that had held bowls, cloth that had wrapped herbs, small pips and husks trapped in corners where mice could not go. Sometimes metalwork so elaborate that it felt like thunder, held in gold cups and fittings shaped into stags, taking flight, or panthers forever mid-pounce. Under such a lid of wealth, the plant arrived as a humble constant, a few seeds, a residue clinging to a vessel, a trace that insists on a memory of a smoke. You can almost stage a send-off from what the earth returned. The grave pit is lined with felt. A sled pulled by horses lowers the honored body. There are saddles, bridles, arrows nested like the ribs of a fish. There's a mirror for looking and a comb for ordering hair. On the other side, there's meat spiced against rot, because hunger should not interrupt the long road. And there's a set of bowls, a portable fire pan, a pouch of seed or flowers. The last belonging is not a thing, but a capacity, the power to make a room inside the world when you need it most, and fill it with breath that changes grief's hard edge into something round enough to carry. Think of that room as a kind of theater. The entrance is a threshold. The flare of seed on a stone is a first curtain. The stories are a script learned across generations. It is communal, but also rigorously private. The faces you love are inches away, and yet your mind is wandering a landscape where the dead are not gone, but simply slower. Like riders you can still see on the next rise. In that theater, the smoke is light, and the light is permission. We are tempted to call this intoxication and leave it at that, but the word is too thin for what is happening. The Scythians do not flee their lives, they fold them gently and set them down. The body learned from horses, from bowstrings, from cold. Now it learns from vapor the pacing of thought, the letting go of clenched memories. When the tent door opens and night pours back in, the mourners step out changed, not irresponsible, but reproportioned. The world still hurts. The wound is still the wound. But breath has had a long drink, and a steadiness has returned like an old friend who brings no advice, only company. Herodotus tells us about howling, and readers for centuries have made much of that word, hearing in it either barbarity or bliss. It may have been both. How else do you register a feeling that runs faster than language? The sound that carries through the skin walls into the night is less a cry of excess than the body's way of tuning itself like a horse making a long, low sound before the run. The step has its own acoustics. A voice goes far, comes back altered. Inside, laughter also happens, the cracked kind that arrives when sadness comes to sit close and, oddly, lets you breathe. Funeral tents were not the plant's only home. Hunters, returning bone-tired and wind-burnt, held smaller sessions, a hand's worth of seed on a travel iron, the esteem rising in a winter wind while horses drowsed. Wedding saw it, to a seal on vows, a gentling of a strangers into kin. The plan's roll traveled the social year. If a thing was heavy and needed to be lifted by many hands, smoke might join the lifting. From tombs in the Altai to the dark soil along the Don, archaeologists have pulled up other kinds of proof fibers from clothing with the quiet sheen of hemp, seed jars burned black along their rims, residues in vessels that remember what they held. The glittering artifacts get the press, the worked gold, the weapons, but the truer testament is ordinary, a hearth repair, a fiber snag still caught in a comb, a tiny heap of seeds that fell where no child or rat could reach them and lay waiting for a spade 3,000 winters later. What the Scythians knew in their riders' bones is that smoke is a road you can take without moving your camp. It reorganizes the room inside the skull, turns the edges to velvet for an hour, lets words arrive not as commands but as visitors who knock first. In a culture with no permanent buildings and no patience for sentimentality that wastes daylight, that hour mattered. It was how a people without stone walls made inner architecture strong enough to hold a sorrow and not collapse. When the kurgan is closed and the horses turn to pasture, when wind resumes its long ownership of the grass, the tent is a truck and rolled, the stones go cold, the pouch is tied shut. Life returns to the quick arithmetic of the plains weather, distance, pasture, water, but something from the tent remains, traveling light, a tolerance for the mind's weather, an agreement that breath has more than one job in a human being, and a memory that a simple plant seed on coals can make a room where past and present sit together for a while without quarreling. The smoke in the steppe is one of our earliest clear records of people inhaling cannabis for what it does to the mind, not for what it does to rope. There will be other rooms, the sanctuaries of India, where bhang is drunk with hymns, the cave temples of China, where incense sketches futures, the courtyards of Cairo, where hashish becomes a whispered philosophy, but the Scythian tent stands early and plain, stones, seed, felt, breath, and a sky so large that even grief must learn to move in it. The howling is only the chorus. The heart of the scene is quieter hands passing a bowl, a story told twice, and the living is stepping back into daylight with their balance returned. India meets the plant not with secrecy but with welcome, garlanded, named, and folded into prayer. Cannabis steps from hedgerow to shrine and acquires many titles: bhang for the drink, vijaya for the medicine that conquers, siddhi for the modest attainment that loosens the brow. Rather than argue good or bad in the abstract, India gives the leaf a place at the table. A loved tale says Shiva, footsore from wandering, rested under a tree, tasted its bitterness, and found a tempered calm. From then on, the leaf belonged to vigil and song as much as to poultice and oil. It is not rebellion that crowns the plant here, but companionship, a shared understanding that mind and body sometimes need a gentler temperature. The oldest hymns leave a space for green allies that soften hard hours. Among verses that yoke dawn to duty, appear notes about leaves that cool fever, seeds that coax appetite, and resins that persuade pain to release its bite. Physicians will later fold cannabis into the measured grammar of Ayurveda bodies run hot or cold, dry or damp, quick or heavy. Bitterness cushioned by milk or ghee can be asked to help instead of a harm. The plant is no miracle, only a capable neighbor, useful when rightly prepared, troublesome when indulged without measure. In the clinic ledger, it sits among friends: ginger, long pepper, nutmeg, its action described with the even voice healers reserve for herbs that are strong but teachable. Bhang is not smoked, it is ground. Watch the mortar and pestle at work in a courtyard blue with evening. The stone is rinsed until the water runs clear. Leaves and tender tops go in with a scatter of pale seeds. Almonds for body, fennel for lift, black pepper for warmth, and cardamom for fragrance, sugar for courage, a thread of saffron if a festival has been generous, rose water when the season allows, and always milk or yogurt, so bitterness rides in safely. Hands that know the rhythm turn the pestle until the paste shines. The mixture is thinned and strained through a cloth. What emerges is not a flame, but a food green, cool at the lip, carrying a spice and leaf together like two notes held in one breath. Festivals are the plant's favorite stage. On Maha Shivaratri, the night of Shiva, who wears the crescent moon like a quiet thought, worshippers keep vigil until sunrise. Drums thud like a steady heart. Bells punctuate the dark. Stories of Shiva and Parvati pass between neighbors on temple steps. A priest smears ash, murmurs a blessing, and offers cups of bhang not to induce forgetfulness, but to make focus easier, less scattering of thought, more patience for a long night of chant. The drink steadies discipline. It is not license, it is a cushion for the needs of the mind. If a breeze lifts the lamp flame and the mantra wavers, the cup reminds the breath to return. When Holi arrives like an armful of color, bhang changes register without breaking faith. It becomes laughter's accomplice, the thing that makes a shy cousin dance, that helps a quarrelsome uncle forgive last year's small insult. If winter has been long or the harvest uncertain, a measured cup shapes the day for joy. Lighter feet, softer tempers, the plant enters the body and adjusts the room's temperature. The way a curtain drawn just so removes glare from an afternoon, colors fly, drums chatter, and neighbors who barely nod in July find themselves arm in arm, giggling under a pink cloud that will stain their shirts for days. At a shrine doorway, a sadhu warms his hands around that same mixture, the spice opening his lungs. He does not speak much. His work is to watch breath count itself and let the mind's weather pass. For him, the leaf is not an escape ladder, but a rail to hold while walking a narrow path. He takes less than a reveler and mixes it to steady, not excite, the way a singer sips honeyed water to coax a note into the world. Later, he pounds a pinch with basil and black pepper and a drop of ghee, a private, careful sacrament that quiets the body's noise so prayer can find a longer note. Some evenings, the plant is medicine first and last. A shopkeeper with a burning shoulder and a back that yelps when he turns stirs a spoon of seed paste into warm milk and sleeps without bargaining with his mattress. A mother of 3, nerves trilled thin by noise and debt, rubs a little oil into her wrists and temples before sitting by the door to think. A wrestler in an old akara adds a pinch to a tonic so soreness becomes a visitor instead of a squatter. These are not ceremonies, but they are faithful, practical mercies that turn suffering down to something the day can manage. Ayurveda asks for proportion. What calms one constitution rattles another. Dose matters as much as intent. The same leaf that helped a widow eat again after months of grief can make a young man lazy if he turns a feast day portion into a daily rite. So recipes keep their own footnotes, grind longer if the leaf is mature. Balance bitter with fat. Avoid in the hottest months if the blood already runs hot. This is not fear, it is respect. The kind farmers give a monsoon grateful when rains are timely, cautious when the river swells. The ethic is simple right amount, right person, right day, and it travels as proverb, not law. In the lanes outside a temple, the social life of bhang is easy to map. Men with red-threaded wrists and women whose hands are flour-stained from stringing marigolds stand at a brass counter and talk about grain prices, cricket scores, and the marriage the priest approved last week. A teenager who should have been home an hour ago waits with exaggerated patience. A widow buys 2 measures wrapped in paper and ties them with ordinary string. The server knows everyone's names and tolerances. He raises an eyebrow at the boastful and softens the mix for the tired. Community here is not an idea. It is a conversation spoken in cups. You can see why prohibitions struggle to cling to this plant here. It is not hidden. It is woven. It does not belong to villains. It belongs to priests and grandfathers, to new husbands too nervous to speak, to old friends who meet twice a year and need a little oil to loosen the lid of the past. When it is abused, and it is, because we are human, the correction rarely begins with chains. It begins with an ant's sharp look, then smaller cups, and a walk after supper. The lesson is social before it is legal, which is exactly why it often works. A cup of bhang does something gentler than a pipe. It arrives through the stomach and into the blood like a slow traveler who removes his sandals at the door. The body receives it as food, which, in truth, it is a seed and leaf and milk and a spice, a meadow's worth of constituents invited to sit at the same table. This is why the onset is late and the landing often softer. The mind feels combed, the chest loosens, speech becomes less angular. If a god listens, it is because the room has quieted enough for listening. None of this means India is naive about risk. The same traditions that praise the plant warn about a sloth and the fraying of will. Priests teach that the cup for worship is not a cup for hiding. The reason to drink on Shiva's night is to bring the mind to one place, not to run from all places. The line is simple enough to say and difficult enough to keep. So every generation repeats it, the way a family passes down a recipe until even the children can stir without spilling. The story honors restraint, not bravado. Stand at the edge of a courtyard on a festival night, and you will hear the plant's 3 registers at once. From the temple, the devotional, the bell, the mantra, a chorus that rises and falls like the tide. From the alley, the social laughter, teasing, and all the story retold with better timing. From the clinic across the lane, the medicinal, a kettle hissing, a cough easing, a chair creaking as someone finally leans back, one leaf laid across 3 kinds of human need without insisting that one swallow the others. The world will later send this plant to other rooms' armories, parliaments, jails, and the tone will change. But in this chapter, the cup is still clay, the milk still foamed by hand, and the pestle still bruises the leaves until their scent stands up and stretches. The god accepts his ash and smiles. A pilgrim shivers less in the night wind. A grandmother who misses her husband most in March sleeps without waking at the hour when grief knocks. If enlightenment feels too large a word, call it this instead: companionship of leaf and a spice, of breath and chant, of people learning together how to carry the long night more gently. The house has another room, and the door opens not onto a festival lane, but into a cave where breath leaves a smoke on the ceiling. Here, China's seekers turn from pharmacies and fields to the inside weather of the mind. If earlier we saw ledgers and looms, this is the chapter where incense is measured like a sentence and burned like a question. Daoist adepts bring cannabis to the brazier not to flee the world, but to tune attention the way a musician plucks a single string until it hums against a hidden note. Picture the threshold. The cave mouth faces a slope of pines. Water ticks somewhere in the dark. Lamps soften a stone to honey. A brazier the size of 2 hands warms a bed of charcoal. The herb is not heaped. It is pinched ground with mountain plants that smell of rain and rock and sprinkled over the glow. Vapor rises first as a thin ribbon, then widens like a stream when winter loosens its grip. The room changes, not much, just enough for the ear to catch a softer footstep in the head. A monk counts gently with his breath, then lets the numbers dissolve like salt. The old manuals insist this is not intoxication, it is adjustment. The mind is a mill that runs whether grain is poured or not. Incense is a way to change what the stones say to each other. Breathe and count. When the count steadies, breathe without it. If thoughts arrive loud, let them pass like pilgrims on a narrow ridge. If they refuse, change the mixture a touch more bitter to anchor, a thread more sweet to unbraid a stubborn knot of worry. The recipe is an instrument. The room is the hand that plays it. Taoism keeps two laboratories that speak across a courtyard. The furnace of outer alchemy, where metals are married and tested, and the quiet house of inner work, where breath, posture, and intention are joined. In both, cannabis appears as a helper with a gentle voice. It is not the hero, it is the lamp. Night watchers under constellations describe the plant in their notes as something that loosens bindings, opens a gate at the center, and lends clarity to true breath. Those phrases sound grand until you watch the practice. It often looks like a person sitting very still and learning not to hurry their own chest. Ritual here is simple and exact. Close the door, sweep the floor, set water and salt in 2 shallow bowls to remember ocean and shore. Touch the forehead with ash to invite seriousness, and to confess, before anyone else can say it, that all bodies go to dust, and that dust can scent the air. Someone keeps time, someone keeps watch, someone minds the brazier. For fire is a servant that demands manners. If a vision comes a sudden brightness behind the eyes, or a sense that a word has been spoken in a room where no one moves, it is written down without flourish. Tomorrow, the work resumes at the same hour. Some commentaries give the plant a startling epithet, calling it a kind of liberator, untying guilt, loosening tightness, undoing the grip of a thought that has mistaken itself for law. That does not mean license. The same texts warn that the force that unbinds, if welcomed without measure, can also unmoor. A student who arrives chasing fireworks is given less mix and more sweeping. A teacher who sees sleepiness creeping into discipline lets the brazier rest and works with breath alone. The aim is a mind that can stand on its own feet when the bowl of ash is empty. This refusal to confuse tools with goals runs through the scrolls like a margin note written in many hands. The ideal is a mind that can sit still in rain without asking the sky to stop. Incense, cannabis among it, is a conditional kindness. It can make the chair more comfortable without becoming the chair. So doses are small, rooms are spare, rites are brief enough to memorize and long enough to soften stubbornness. If clarity does not come, adjust the mix. If clarity comes too quickly and pride blooms, leave the brazier cold for a week and tend the garden instead. Step outside the cave and you hear another voice answering this one. Confucian scholars in clean robes keep brush stands tidy and days ordered. They look at the cave and see a danger to the ledger. Families need sons who come home from meditation and still rise with dawn to care for parents, plow fields, study the classics, and keep their tempers when neighbors grow loud. Anything that slackens the bonds of duty looks, from that porch, like rain rotting a beam. The essays say as much. Sobriety makes for reliable character. Reliable character makes for reliable states. The debate is as old as the first time someone set down a broom to consider a cloud. Daoists answer that clarity, once cultivated, makes a stronger sons. A man who knows the knot in his own chest will not shout at a child who spills rice. Confucians reply that clarity, which depends on vapor, is a ladder with missing rungs. The truth as so often in this old house lives between rooms. There are adepts who forget their duties and vanish into hills the way a moth disappears into a lamp flame. There are also scholars who harden into law until law bruises the people it means to hold. Meanwhile, ordinary lives borrow a little from both rooms and keep the country going. A village shrine might burn a pinch in a festival bell's shadow, not to fly into visions, but to slow a crowd into listening before the elder speaks. A midwife warms a bead of oil and rubs it into a laboring woman's back, while someone fans a window and someone else heats water. When grief sits on a family's chest like an ox, the temple keeper lights a stick and says a name until breathing evens out and the room remembers how to be a room. Because China loves method, the method persists. Even where the plant's other uses are regulated or renamed, smaller arts survive as kitchen wisdom. Keep the brazier small, keep the door latch easy, burn less than you think, wait longer than you want. Let the result tell you what to do next time. If the mix makes the mind ripple like a pond struck by a stone, have it. If it does nothing at all, consider that perhaps what is needed is not scent, but sleep. In this way, mysticism acquires the modesty of housekeeping. The same bureaucracy that made paper from hemp and then kept the empire's record on it leaves fingerprints here too. Notes survive that read like field reports on the 7th day of the 7th moon. After fasting, a mixture of 3 parts leaf to 5 parts. Tender top with 1 part aromatic resin was burned. Perception sharpened, dreams clear. No heaviness at waking. This is neither gossip nor confession. It is civil service applied to inner weather. The result is a tradition that can be taught, corrected, and handed on with fewer superstitions clinging to it. Not all rooms are caves. Some are all halls with altars polished by 1,000 sleeves. Talismans hang like moth wings from beams. Bells are tied with red thread. The floor smells of camphor and old sandalwood. A night service opens with a slow drum that sounds like a heart remembering how to beat after a run. The officiant lifts a spoon from a wax-sealed jar and gives the brazier a brief, respectful gesture. No one swoons. The chant does that work. The smoke invites the mind to pick up the same note and hold it a little longer. Austerity also has its saints. Confucian halls, framed by courtyards of a swept stone, lean toward a different perfume, the ink of fresh copywork, and the starch of washed linen. A teacher asks a student who arrived late from a mountainside vigil to read aloud from a classic about filial piety. The boy stumbles, the teacher sighs, and closes the lesson with a proverb. If you would cultivate the self, set it in order. If you would order the world, begin with the self. Outside, a pine leans, and the same wind crosses both schools as if to say the air belongs to neither. We are telling a plant's history, but it mirrors the human one. A society that tolerates both ledger and cave endures droughts better. A family that knows both ritual and mercy survives scandal with less breaking. Cannabis, in this chapter, teaches the lesson of tools. A thing can be sacred in one room and practical in another. It can assist a vigil without becoming the point of the vigil. It can help a mind loosen a cruel idea and still send that mind home to wash the bowls. When dawn comes, the cave opens to a sky powdered with the last stars. The brazier is emptied, the floor swept, the bowls set back on their shelf. In the town below, Paper makers rinse vats, farmers bend over seedlings, clerks unroll scrolls that whisper when they move. Somewhere a scholar pens another warning about indulgence. Somewhere an adept pens another note about clarity. The argument goes on like a river that never needs to win to keep flowing. And in the background, the plant waits with its ordinary patience, ready to be friend or distraction depending on the hand that holds it. Soon our story will leave the cave and return to daylight, the docks and caravans, where hemp's muscles built ships and bound cargo, the quiet triumph by which a plant crossed continents without an army. But keep this room in mind, not all revolutions arrive with banners. Some arrive as a pinch of powder on a coal, a slower pulse, and a mind that returns to its work with cleaner hands. Step outside the cave and into daylight docks, yards, markets, and the noise of ordinary genius. If one wing of the plant's story is incense and vigil, the other is work fibers that do not sulk in rain, rope that forgives assault, thread that keeps its temper when pulled hard by a hungry tide. Before it ever met a censor or a hymn, hemp learned to hold. And by holding boats to piers, sails to masts, bales to wagons, it quietly lengthened the reach of peoples who would one day argue about gods and laws across seas. They had no business crossing without those fibers. In a shipyard, dawn stings like vinegar. Tar warms, pitch wakes, gulls declare opinions. A boy walks the length of a hull with a coil slung across his shoulder, hemp line as thick as his wrist. Carpenters speak in mallet syllables. Caulkers kneel in rows as if at prayer, pressing fiber into seams where wood will meet water. Somewhere a kettle mutters, and the rigger tests a length by hanging his weight from it and bouncing twice. No one looks surprised when it holds. Hemp is not novelty, it is the expectation that a thing made well will behave. The sea is a tutor that never grows polite, and hemp proves itself in every lesson. Dry, it is stiff with purpose, soaked. It swells and seals its own weaves. Lines bite and release on command. Knit meshes open and close like enormous hands. On deck, sailors trust what their palms know. A good hawser will sing a low note when pulled across wood. A tired one will complain in whispers before it fails. In that world where a week's storm can shave down a crew's bravado to stubborn prayer, a plant that remembered a strength after punishment earns respect faster than any anthem. Follow those lines ashore and they keep working. In market towns that ring the inner seas, where Egypt's barges slide by with silt-stained grain, and Levantine traders count dates into baskets with practiced flicks of the wrist hemp wraps, binds, and steadies, sacks wear it like belts. Dolia, those great belly jar amphorae, learn not to wobble under its cross-hatched tethers. On river islands, ferrymen loop coils in tidy figure eights that look like writing. A village reads its livelihood in those tidy shapes. Fish will come because nets are ready. Harvest will move because cords lie waiting. The plant's other careers never pause. In Egypt, the light falls like law, as exact at noon as a judge's finger. There, balms and oils borrow a pinch of resin to coax nerves into quiet and inflammation back toward its proper size. You can see the logic in a priest's careful hands as he warms a salve for a temple dancer's aching knee or for a laborer whose shoulders have learned the geometry of stones. The balm smells of sesame and something faintly bitter. Relief is not thunder, it is a slow disassembling of complaint. In the same city, a rope walk stretches like a sentence. Two men twist and step, until a length thicker than a man's arm lies on the floor like a domesticated river. Across the water, the old arguing Greeks examine everything they touch. In a physician's room, where sunlight behaves itself along a plaster wall, dressings are laid out like patient thoughts. The thread glinting in a needle's eye is hemp. Bowstrings, too, on a morning range outside the city, carry its grain a way of storing straightness and anger until a soldier asks for both in one breath. Later, when the same men lean into shade with cups of wine, their talk pirouettes from duty to doubt and back again, and someone mentions the plant, the nets it makes, the aches it eases, and the table hums with reasonable assent. No one calls it miracle. That is praise enough for a culture suspicious of gullibility. To the east, caravans step-link oases together with the patience of prayer beads. Camels kneel, grunt, and bear up under burdens stitched into obedience by hemp lashings. Tents rise and fall with ropes that know their knots. The plant's presence in a caravan is like a single well-packed tool chest. It answers a dozen problems without bragging. When a wheel rim cracks under heat, when a storm shucks pegs from the ground like bad teeth, when a merchant needs 3 more secure ties and has only 2 hands, the same coil supplies, that is how plants travel without wandering people who love them enough to take them everywhere. Back in workshops, the plant hides in the obvious. A sandal might look like nothing more than leather and a stubbornness until you flip it and find hemp stitching briskly doing its job in the dark. An archer's kit contains a spare string that has tasted beeswax. Its lay remembers the fingers that made it and will forgive the sweaty ones that draw it in panic. A fisherman's house smells of brine and smoke, and something green on sunny days when nets hang over beams to dry. If he's wealthy, his net is large enough to read as a wall. If he's poor, it is small but exact, and he mends it while humming, a song his father learned by listening to the rhythm of repair. The plant also learns to carry words, though not everywhere on sheets made from itself. In the West, papyrus and parchment keep the scribes busy, but hemp threads bind ledgers and strengthen covers. A scroll tied with a narrow hemp ribbon stays honest in a humid summer. A scribe whose lamp eats oil pressed from hemp seeds watches his letters stand out against smooth fibers with gratitude he never writes down. The civilization that prides itself on memory geography in the mouth, laws in the ear, still trusts bindings. A knot can keep a secret as well as any priest. We talk glibly about trade routes as if they were lines on a board. But routes are people, and people carry habits. A weaver from a valley that loves the plant will teach a coastal cousin to twist rope that sleeps soft in the hand. A shipwright from a loud harbor will show a mountain carpenter how to make a hinge that doesn't sulk hemp packing under a wooden pivot. A dab of oil, the wine of friction, traded for the sigh of function. In this way, the plant's exhibitions become apprenticeships. Good practice spreads faster than empire. All the while, the plant refuses to be only infrastructure. In any alley where bodies work hard and sleep light, you will find the other uses humming quietly. An elderly potter with wrists that argue when the rain comes once a year rubs an infusion of seed into the tendons, and rolls clay the way a baker comforts dough. A soldier with a wound stitched too tight touches a salve to the puckered edge and watches the skin regard him with less malice. A widow who cannot eat breaks her fast with a spoon of porridge brightened by oil and finishes the bowl out of sheer surprise. The plant's politeness, its willingness to enter by the back door and do its chores before anyone comments on the smell, makes it beloved in homes that are tired of speeches. Empires, for their part, learn to issue orders to hemp. A crown announces quotas: so many fields per district, so many ropes for the navy by winter, so many nets to replace what the sea will steal. Compliance looks like a row of men with blackened hands and a yard that smells of sun-wet fiber and hot iron. These commands do not feel like tyranny to a culture that lives by water. They feel like insurance. When a storm comes greedy, one ship that does not break free of its moorings pays back a season of mandates. In markets, you can hear the plant's economy in the literal sense: its husbandry, its thrift. A broken basket handle becomes cord, leftover line becomes net patch, soft toe becomes oakum tamped into seams. There is joy in this reuse that is older than slogans. The pride of someone who knows how to get 7 lives out of one stalk. If waste is impiety in a hard world, then hemp is a small church where piety is easy to practice. The practical empire the plant builds is quiet, but it is not small. By giving hands reliable strength, its sponsors risk a fishery farther offshore, a season's grain ferried downriver instead of rotting in a storage yard, a voyage that dares a longer arc because someone trusts his rigging to forgive a sudden squall. Over time, these increments add to a change you can map. Cities rise where lines crossed often and held. Languages lean toward each other over counters that would not exist if bundles could not be secured without fear. Of course, usefulness attracts a scrutiny. Guilds protect techniques. Magistrates inspect rope the way they inspect weights: too light and you cheat, too weak and you endanger. Arguments bloom over fiber sources, retting times, twist direction. It is the kind of debate only healthy traditions have: vigorous, boring to outsiders, absolutely essential to insiders. A sailor can tell which valley a rope came from by how it behaves in rain. A weaver can guess a household's fortunes by the neatness of the warp. Attention itself becomes a form of wealth. When night returns, our shipyard sleeps, but the fibers do not. They keep their quiet oaths. The plant has done what a few creatures and fewer inventions manage, woven itself into the threshold between land and water, between intention and action. Before emperors dream of conquering each other's capitals, they must conquer distance. Before they conquer distance, they must ask a plant to hold the plant together. Hemp answers as it always has, without flourish. In the morning, the same boy will shoulder a new coil, and the same gulls will heckle him, and the same ropes will sing low and satisfying when tested. Soon, in shaded courtyards and lamplit rooms, people will ask the plant to do more metaphysical work, carry prayers, loosen certainties, embroider visions. In Persia and beyond, smoke will learn a different grammar, and words like kunabu will slip into the mouths of priests and poets. But this chapter belongs to hands and knots, to tar and salt and ordinary faith that something made carefully will not betray you. The world's long conversation needed a reliable tether, a green stalk offered one, and humanity, ever practical when it must be, said yes. By the time the plant crossed from river kingdoms into the Iranian world, it carried a resume longer than a caravan manifest rope maker, paper mother, balm for joints and sleeplessness. In Mesopotamian ledgers, it appears as a working herb. In Persia, it learns a new job title, a language for smoke. The Assyrian tablets keep a word for it, kunabu, sometimes konobu, a syllable that smells faintly of resin and warm stone. In temple precincts, where incense braziers count out the hours like hearts, kunabu joins frankincense and myrrh and a storax, and the air becomes a scroll you can breathe. Priests, patient as astronomers at dawn, burn mixtures in sequence the way a scribe orders clauses. First, the bitter that clarifies, then the sweet that soothes. After that, a resin that invites attention to sit upright. The room takes on the old grammar of ritual, a threshold, a circle, a listening, the smell changes, and along with it, the complexion of thought. This is not intoxication bragging in a public. It is court etiquette for the mind. Petitioners speak softer, auguries look less like riddles and more like well-lit corridors. We know this not from confession priests, rarely kept diaries for gossip, but from the cool voice of medical lists and temple inventories, where Kwanabu sits in the column with items that help a spirit do its part. Outside the columns and thresholds, physicians in the shadow of royal courts carry the plant in their bags as well. Melancholy, the old heaviness of mornings that will not begin, meets a decoction that includes the seed. Pain that snarls a hand into a paw is encouraged to unclench. A convalescent chews a paste and discovers food tastes like food again. If a poet later claims that smoke taught him to hear colors, that is the poet's business. The clinic's notes are modest and humane. Soothe here. Stir there. Quiet the mind long enough to let the body remember its work. If Mesopotamia provides the ledger, Persia provides the room with high windows and fire at its center. Zoroastrian thought, with its clean love of order, Asha, and its alert suspicion of the lie, Druj organizes attention around flame. Atar is not only warmth, it is presence. Magi attend the fire like a beloved relative, feeding it, reading it, asking it to witness vows. In this house of light, smoke becomes messenger. Some ritualists, quiet men whose nights smell of ghee and herbs, add a pinch of plant to an offering to persuade the mind toward vohu mana, the good mind that accompanies truth. The idea is not to float, but to align an internal spine straightened to match the world's. Not every priest approves. A tradition ruled by a pure element fire does not casually invite another into its center. You can hear the counter-argument in a single sentence if clarity can be bought in a bowl. Counterfeiters will prosper. So practice diverges. In some sanctuaries, the smoke is only cedar and frankincense. In others, a more private incense includes a green note the officiant does not discuss with visitors. The argument repeats itself across years like a chorus does a tool that wakes attention, honor the flame, or insult it by implying the mind cannot find its own feet. Meanwhile, philosophers and the storytellers borrow the plant for quieter evenings. In a courtyard in Ekbatana or Susa, where the summer wind lifts linen like a sigh, men sit on rugs and talk until the lamps make halos on the wall. They talk about kings, which is treason, and about the soul, which is not, and about the way a thought can be truer when it arrives less armored. A little smoke circulates like a patient teacher. Harshness leaves the voice. Certainties take off their shoes at the door. Someone raises the name of Zarathustra and asks whether good thought is a matter of discipline alone or whether, like a harp string, it sometimes benefits from a resin rubbed along it to hold the note. No one agrees. The night does not require agreement, only seriousness. Where there's temple, there's administration. Where there's administration, there's fear that private clarity will wreck public order. If people can feel close to the divine without the long hallway of rites, what becomes of the hallway voices from the palace worry correctly that access is power. The smell of suspicion begins to cling to the plant, not because it is wicked, but because it does not pay fees. In public, edicts frown. In private, some of the same men who wrote them take a little smoke in the company of a trusted friend before deciding whether to answer a letter in anger or in patience. The plant learns cunning in this environment. It moves best along honest routes in traders' packs as seed, in apothecaries' jars as oil, in priests' cupboards as one pinch among many. It also moves as rumor, which floats faster than any caravan. There is a den near the market where merchants' tongues loosen and poems are born. There is a man in the hills who can find the exact proportion that takes grief's edge off without stealing its shape. There's a circle of mystics who stand by a fire and taste smoke the way others taste arguments. Whether any single rumor is true matters less than the steady reality under them. Ideas now ride this plant the way bundles ride a camel. Out on the road itself, the Silk Route is not a road at all, but a biography of patience. Camp is a truck. Knots are tied. Camels swat flies like old men dismissing gossip. Hemp lashes keep gear from sulking loose. Tents rise with their help, and at night, a merchant, sick of counting bolts of cloth, shares a pipe with a bookish man headed the other direction. What is traded in that moment is not silk or spice, but permission. When he reaches Antioch or Bactra, he will not introduce a product, he will introduce a way of sitting. The first thing that crosses borders is always posture. Words drift with the trade. Kunabu becomes something like cannabis in other mouths. The story that smoke carries prayer picks up new costumes: Jewish, Christian, Greek, and the idea keeps its skeleton even as it learns new languages. In Iran proper, the habit attaches to different houses over time: royal courts in one century, heretics' kitchens in another, scholars' studies in a third. The plant is a litmus for fashion in piety. When authorities feel secure, they ignore it. When they feel brittle, they forbid it, because nothing terrifies a nervous regime like private composure. And yet, the private scenes persist. A Zoroastrian artisan with a back like a question mark warms his cup by a brazier and finds that for 1 hour his pain speaks a dialect he can tolerate. A young scribe, nervous about reciting before a patron, takes a cautious breath and discovers he can read without swallowing the ends of his lines. A traveler cradles a bowl, watches smoke rise like a second road into the night, and feels less far from his own language. The poor do not have the luxury of philosophy every evening. They do have evenings. Sometimes that is enough. If you listen for cruelty in this chapter, you will not hear it. The plant is not a cudgel here. It is a bridge, a delicate one, subject to weather and misuse. sometimes leading only to a prettier view of the same problem. But bridges matter in countries where rivers rule. The ritualists who used it seriously spoke of carrying the word upward, not as flattery to gods, but as a description of what breath does when invited. The philosophers who used it lightly called it a softener. The rulers called it a nuisance. All three were telling a portion of the truth. Of course, there are wrecks. There's always a man who takes 2 cups when one was measured for him. Always a youth who mistakes a temporary keenness for wisdom itself. Stories here carry warnings not because moralists enjoy wagging fingers, but because tools bite when held wrong. If a ladder helps you reach a fruit tree, it can also tip if you dance on it. This is not a revelation. It is peasant knowledge disguised as theology. When the plant leaves Persia for Greece and further west, it does not march like an army. It drifts like a style of listening. In symposiums, men will argue more pleasantly under its shade. In apothecaries' rooms, doctors will add it to their lists and pretend they discovered it themselves. The thing that changes is not only who holds the plant, but what they ask of it. In some hands, it remains rope, in others, remedy, in others, a question in the shape of smoke. What Persia added is this, a habit of using the plant to think with, not to escape thought or to crown it, but to move it through a different corridor, the one with high windows, where fire is tended and a door opens on the night. In that corridor, you can hear footsteps approach: the Assyrians with their ledgers, the Zoroastrians with their polished brass, the philosophers with their questions, the merchants with their jokes. Smoke rises. Someone speaks a prayer, or a premise, or a price. The plant sits between them like a translator who loves all the languages in the room and asks only that voices be a fraction kinder than usual. By the time lamps glowed in Baghdad observatories and scribes in Cairo copied star maps so clean they looked like hymns, the plant had learned a new costume, a resin pressed, small enough to hide in a sleeve and powerful enough to tilt an evening. Algebra and epics, pharmacies and paper this age loved clarity. Yet in its courtyards and alleys, a softer practice took root, one that asked not for conquest of the mind, but for its quieting. Hashish, prepared from the same old leaf and flower, arrived like a polite guest, nobody named out loud, useful, troubling, and stubbornly hard to evict. The law began with first principles. Wine was forbidden. That much the holy book said plainly, but cannabis had no clear verse attached to it, only arguments. Jurists kept their ink honest and their brows furrowed. If a thing clouds judgment, is it the same as wine if it does not ferment? Is it another category? Counselors filled margins with cautious words blameworthy, suspicious, a danger to dignity. Others, more severe, wrote the single word that ends conversations forbidden and underlined it. The consensus never settled entirely, and because it didn't, ordinary people did what they always do when authority disagrees with itself. They looked to their bodies and their days, physicians, more practical than pious in their appointment books, set the leaf and reason on a shelf with other aids that could make a stubborn symptom move. A name like Ibn Sina appears in medical catalogs beside notes so calm they sound like recipes, a seed for appetite in those who have forgotten to eat, a preparation to ease the stomach's rebellion, a calming measure for a night that will not end. Al-Razi's chapter headings carry the same tone. Try this. And if the patient's tongue grows heavy, reduce the dose or replace the ingredient that heats the blood. You can hear in these sentences the shrug of a world that would rather see a man sleep than argue until dawn about his immortal soul. Outside the clinic, the plant found other schools. In a shaded zawiya tucked off a market street, men and women gathered for remembrance. They sat on reed mats. Someone tuned an oud until the room's breath matched its string. The work here was not doctrine, but attention. God's name repeated until the mind's loose boards stopped creaking, a drum that kept the chest honest, a soft swaying that made thought move like a boat on a river at dusk. At the edge of the circle, a small dish passed quietly from hand to hand. No fanfare, no surrender, a pinch to still a jitter, to let a chant carry longer, to make room for a tenderness that pride normally blocks with its elbows. They said it helped them hear the call and not just recite it. The jurists warned about that dish. If a tool for devotion makes people lazy, the tool has mistaken itself for the craft. Some orders listened and kept their circles bare of every aid but breath. Others allowed a measured kindness on festival nights. For the man who could not sleep because grief pressed on his ribs, for the woman whose hands shook until the remembrance began. A line of poetry anonymous, because wisdom in such matters loves a veil made the rounds. It is not the bowl that blesses, but the name we carry through it. That line let both sides keep their dignity a little longer. Cairo learned a geography of discretion. There were rooms where hashish did not enter, the way shoes do not enter a sanctum. There were rooms where the door stayed open and the talk went on, whether the dish made an appearance or not. And there were rooms you found by accident, following a soft clatter of cups and a laugh that sounded relieved rather than loud. In those rooms, the plant was medicine for the hour's weather. The tailor, who sewed until his shoulders burned, took 2 draws and remembered to stretch. The widow, whose heart rattled like a drawer shut too hard, took one and found a sleep closer. The storyteller took none at all and benefited anyway, because an audience that unknots a little will follow a tale anywhere. Crackdowns arrived on schedule, as crackdowns do. Anxious rulers issued decrees. Fields were cut, resin pots smashed. Dens shuddered. The smell of sanctimony briefly outmuscled the softer smells of spice and oil and lampwick. Officials patrolled with the brisk morale of men whose orders are clear. But the city was older than any edict. It held its secrets like springs under a stone. Merchants rerouted their little economies through cousins and courtyards. Small gardens sprouted where no map bothered to notice them. The dish simply changed its hour and house. Confiscations, it turned out, taught smugglers to carry fewer, better portions. Moral hygiene campaigns taught shopkeepers to hide their kindness behind tea. There is no need to lie about harm. Some men lost their time at the pipe and became thin, their jokes bitter where they had once been kind. A few mystics mistook the foam of a sensation for the sea itself and drowned in their own privacy. Preachers weren't wrong when they said idleness could use any herb as a pillow, but the sermons that made feared the whole story missed a simpler arithmetic in neighborhoods where wages were small and days were long, a thing that made care more bearable had a power no proclamation could match. Law speaks in nouns, ordinary life speaks in verbs. The plant said, quietly, continue. Poets negotiated both worlds with their usual mischief. One wrote a verse in a hand so fine it looked like a silk thread. Hashish smooths the hinge between my ribs and lets the verse swing. Another, more devout, replied with a quatrain that called it a thief of hours. A third rewrote both with a wink. The thief who steals my worry may take my hours freely. In this way, the argument became literature instead of a fistfight. A city that can turn dispute into couplets is hard to govern badly for long. In workshops, the resin had practical uses that never earned it a sermon. A lute maker softened glue with the plant's oil and found his seams kinder when humidity rose. A dyer used it to slow a vat into behaving. A mason with a crushed nail soaked the finger and kept the day's wages. These are infractions only if a man believes God disapproves of relief. Many did not. They were too busy making sure their children ate. Meanwhile, courtiers wrung their hands. A populace with private relief cannot be cajoled with spectacles as easily. If consolation is found in a back room rather than on a parade ground, loyalty leaks from public to private. This is why the plant unsettled palaces more than pulpits. It redistributed comfort. Crackdowns returned like seasons, not because rulers hated the plant, but because they feared losing the spool of public feeling they needed to stitch together their legitimacy. Hashish did not speak. It made silence tolerable. That was enough to terrify men who required noise for proof. And still, the saints who spun did their turning with or without the plant. In Anatolian lodges, the floorboards learned the sound of a barefoot pivot, a measured whirl that taught the body where to put its attention. Light fell through small windows like mercy. The plant was sometimes present and sometimes not. Those who took it explained themselves with a grammar of humility not to rise. They said, only to soften the knot that keeps us from rising. Those who refused it had their own grammar not to depend. They said, because tomorrow's wind may blow the brazier cold, and the practice must stand without it. Both were trying to prevent the same failure, mistaking seasoning for bread. The den, much maligned in edicts, was more library than lair. A storyteller began with a journey. A clerk interrupted to contribute a piece of gossip that turned out to be a proverb. A spice seller closed his eyes and let the oud draw 3 tears he had refused all week. Doors were open. Children ran past. A cat patrolled a shelf like a minor official. Sweet smoke braided with cinnamon from the shop next door. In that room, it was hard to believe you were witnessing a moral collapse. You were watching tired people practice gentleness with themselves until they could manage it with others again. Across the desert and through the passes, another rumor traveled beside the plant. A darker story about a mountain, a stronghold, and men who killed without fear because of what they smoked. That is another chapter, and its truth is a stranger and thinner than the gossip that carried it. For now, keep the Cairo night in mind, a courtyard washed with moonlight, a low song, a dish passed without ceremony, a city with too much noise outside practicing a smaller, kinder kind inside. The law will keep writing, the saints will keep spinning, the plant will keep waiting to be asked a sensible question. The path to the eagle's nest snakes along a ridge so narrow that even the wind takes care. Stone walls grow out of the mountain the way a stern thought grows out of a long silence. This is Alamut, not legend yet, only labor a fortress fitted to rock by men who understood the mathematics of siege and the economy of breath. Water runs in channels cut like calligraphy. Terraces step the slope into green. The rooms are plain, the rules plainer, books are copied, letters sealed, watches kept. If we stand at the gate long enough, we will see what later centuries refused to see: a community arranged around discipline, not delirium. Hassani Saba took this height in 1090 by intelligence rather than avalanche, slipping Dawa, the art of invitation, through the valley until the garrison opened its doors for him. The Seljuk Empire below was loud with triumph and fraying at the seams. Viziers sharpened pens that could bleed a faction dry. Sultans sharpened swords for cousins. In such weather, a man who prized exactness could feel the world as a wobble begging correction. Hassan's correction was not an army. It was geometry, a network of mountain citadels from Dalam to Quistan, a courier system that kept promises within the width of a month, and a cadre of Fidai devotees who would carry a knife as if it were a sentence they had agreed to finish. Enemies recoiled, then reached for story. How could a small, bookish minority make viziers fall in crowded streets and sleep soundly afterward? The answer: planning, patience. Proximity felt like an insult to power. So another explanation grew: legs hashish, a paradise garden, an old man of the mountain who drugged boys into fearless obedience. It is a tale that refuses to die because it flatters the listener. If monsters can be summoned with a smoke, we need not ask how our own negligence lost us cities and friends. Blame the drug. Ignore the cracks in the wall. The record we have, once we brush away pulp, is less theatrical and more unnerving. The Fidai were not cast from frenzy, but from pedagogy. They were taught languages, customs, ways of watching a room without moving their eyes. They learned to pass through a city without leaving crumbs. When they struck, they did so as near as the breath at a doorway, in a mosque aisle, in the press of a festival crowd, choosing places where escape routes were illusions. The goal was not massacre. It was punctuation, an act that would make the next line of politics read differently. Outside these heights, the words curdled. Hashishia entered polemic as a slur: rabble, riffraff. Heretics its root, convenient for a rumor that later ears made literal. Crusaders picked up the noise as travelers pick up stones from interesting rivers, rolling the strange syllables on their tongues. In Syria, a different mountain house at Mashyaf, led by Rashid al-Din Sinan, acquired its own aura. European chronicles stitched the two together into a single cloak, then embroidered it with gardens and potions. Marco Polo, born after the Mongols had already broken Alamut's ridgelines, would bring home the most durable version: lush grounds, sleeping youths, a drug that turned obedience into ecstasy. It is a story designed to reassure rulers that loyalty is never earned, only tricked. There are quieter texts we keep losing amid the shouting. Juvaini, the Mongol-appointed chronicler, visited the ruins after Hulagu's campaign in 1256 and gloated over a library he helped destroy, keeping a few volumes as if they were antlers. In the gloat, you hear fear, the fear of sophisticated enemies whose religion smelled like incense and ink, not like smoke. You also hear insurance if we call them intoxicated. We can ignore the possibility that they were simply better at thinking under pressure. Walk the terraces as they were in their hour of steadiness, and you will not find a stupor. You will find rules about water, watching, and the common table. A boy learns to count by counting steps along a parapet. A girl recites verses that are less about heaven than about patience. A copyist rounds a letter and keeps his wrist straight, because a sloppy script is a hazard. Miscopied orders kill as surely as arrows. When letters leave the gate, they travel with couriers who understand that arrival is an ethic. You do not get lost. You do not improvise what you forget. If you fail, you do not return. These are not the habits of the Daoist. The politics outside remain a thicket. In 1092, the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk fell to a knife. The killing traveled like a comet through rumor and blame. Later, princes and generals learned to take precautions: fewer public prayers, more guarded corridors, a new appreciation for balconies. Crusader lords, too, found themselves on lists. Conrad of Montferrat paid with his life in a street where lamps had just been lit. Each death slid coins off a scale. Each survival left power glancing over its shoulder. To call all of this hashish is to commit a comforting mistake. What made the fidai formidable was not intoxication. It was composure. Composure cannot be confiscated by proclamation. So something else had to fall. In 1256, Huligu's engines dragged their will up the mountain roads. Surrender bargains were made and broken. Towers were toppled. Terraces went to ash. Rukn al-Din Kursha, the last lord of Alamut, yielded and was later killed on the Mongols' long road. Libraries burned. Juvayni's pen sketched condemnation across a smoldering page and made sure future readers inherited a moral: see what becomes of heresy. In the ash, the rumor of drugged youth survived better than the notes on waterworks and wind. And the word assassin slipped its leash. In European mouths, it hardened into a common noun, clipped of its context and polished to a deadly shine. It no longer meant a man who swore a vow in a difficult century. It meant any killer touched by cunning. This is how language carries spoils from one war into every other. A precise history mountains. Couriers, letters seal waxed by moonlight was crushed into a stylish curse. The plant, incidentally, came away stained too, implicated in a crime it did not commit. That is the small tragedy under the grand one. A leaf that had, in other rooms, eased a widow to sleep and softened a mystic's stubbornness, was drafted into a libel to make a minority simpler to hate. Hashishin served as a moving target for fear, not our policies, not our cracks, not our cruelty, your smoke. It is easier to blame fog than to admit that a foe saw you coming because he learned to watch better than you learned to hide. Inside the mountain, men and women did ordinary things with extraordinary insistence. They corrected one another's handwriting. They rehearsed signals until a glance could say, wait, go, or we are not the only ones listening. They planted barley shallow on terraces so roots could find the water laid by stone channels to outlast a siege. They copied books on astronomy, doctrine, and law, yes, law, because living at a cliff's edge makes you hungry for consistency. In a room that smelled of paste and leather, a boy ran his finger down a list of names and learned who was in the valley today and which pass was snowed in. In the kitchen, a woman set aside 3 bowls for a family whose father had not returned. This is not paradise, it is logistics. The myths keep a few truthful lanterns. Discipline can look like enchantment from a distance. Love of a cause feels, to outsiders, like independence from fear. Targeted violence implies magic to those who have only ever known mobs. But the Nizari state's strangest secret was that it did not need a sorcery. It needed less sleep and more steadiness than its enemies. Lost in the smoke is an older, homiliar courage, the kind that sits up with a letter until dawn to make sure the grammar cannot be misread. It is tempting, when telling the story of a word that has become an accusation, to offer counter-myths for comfort. Some modern apologists insist the name never touched hashish at all, that it derives from a nobler root, asis, foundation people of the base. Perhaps language is a capricious archivist. What we can say without pretending is that the people who built Alamut and Masyaf did not need intoxication to do what they did. They needed purpose, a map, and a willingness to pay for a sentence with their own full stop. Down in the lowlands, the rumor still pays rent. Assassin finds work wherever power wants to make a killer sound foreign and inevitable. In that echo, the plant remains on the hook, its name tied to a story that gave rulers back their innocence and took a mountain's careful labor out of the account. Our task, if we would be honest to smoke and the stone alike, is to separate the pleasures of a hashish pipe in a Cairo courtyard from the geometry of a knife in a vizier's ribs. One can soften an evening, the other sharpens a century. The mistake of confusing them has cost more understanding than a bonfire of libraries. When we leave the ridge and look back, the fortress resolves again into the rock, as if the slope were simply remembering itself. Wind takes the path we used, and the valley forgets our names. The long echo, however, hasn't finished its sentence. It will travel on into European poems, into courtroom metaphors, into novels that love a garden too much. But here, where a stone meets a sky, the truth is older and cooler, a disciplined community under pressure, a handful of knives with addresses, a caucus of copyists, a plant with nothing to do but grow if asked and burn if asked. The rest is what frightened empires make to disguise their fear. By the time cannabis drifted into medieval Europe, the continent had perfected a choreography for new ideas, fear them, ban them, and then quietly, hungrily use them anyway. Hemp had come centuries earlier as a laborer rope, oil, cloth, twine, the strong, uncomplaining fiber that kept barns shut, fish in nets, and roofs from sulking in storms. Nobody blushed at hemp. It was the green girding of work. But when the same plant threatened to cross the thin line from remedy to merriment, from poultice to smoke, the church cleared its throat, and the law remembered its Latin. Picture a monastery garden at the edge of a small river, walled more for wind than for sin. Beneath apple trees and along the neat lines of leeks and rue grow tall ranks of hemp, stalks rattling like chimes when the breeze comes up from the ford. Brothers harvest it in the same hour they copy sermons, warning against herbs that loosen the mind's harness. In the scriptorium, a novice smooths hempen paper with a pumice stone and lifts his pen just as the bell calls them to prayer. The room smells faintly of lamp oil pressed from hemp seed and the warm dust of vellum. Outside, reddened ponds wait, their surfaces aslick with the cheerful scum of work well underway. Hemp behaved perfectly in Europe when it behaved like Europe, useful, sober, harnessed to purpose. Fields were measured in ells of fiber, and towns rang with ropewalks, where apprentices paced backwards, twisting a strand into line, line into hawser, hawser into the kind of trussed sailors spit into their palms before setting a sheet. In poor houses, hemp cloth lined winter coats. In rich ones, it hid under silk as a sturdy confidant. You could spend a day among ropes and never think once about smoke. But apothecaries kept their own counsel, which is to say, they listened to pain before they listened to pulpit. Behind counters lined with glass and brass, they ground a seed into soft pastes and warmed leaves in oil until it smelled grassy and right. They wrote in tidy hands for the restless heat of fevers, for rheums and nagging coughs, for female complaints that midwives knew by other names and gentler voices. They recommended drops for sleep and salves for joints that had become quarrelsome with the rain. It worked, and working made it suspicious. In an age that preferred its miracles to come stamped with heavenly authority, any herb that relieved a suffering too plainly risked being accused of immodest competence. Midwives, those quiet engineers of survival, folded the plant into their baskets. A little oil to calm the back during long labors, a bead of salve to comfort cracked skin, a spoon of seed porridge for a woman who'd forgotten how appetite begins. They did not argue theology. They kept mothers alive. Sometimes a priest blessed the child an hour after the midwife had done the same with her practiced hands, and no one quarreled because the baby slept and the house exhaled. But the line between skill and suspicion was hair thin. An herb that softened pain could be renamed malice by anyone with a robe and an audience. Then, as if God wished to complicate everyone's paperwork, crusaders came home with stories from the East. They had seen rooms where men sat on cushions and breathed sweet smoke until the hour's worry drained out of their shoulders. In some tellings, the rooms were dens and the men dissolved into sin. In others, they were salons where tired merchants recovered their manners before returning to wives who preferred them gentle to triumphant. Chroniclers, feeling the strange tug of envy, gave it the name of a vice and called it foreign. The Saracens, one wrote with clean certainty, smoke madness into their souls. Translate that, if you like, as they looked happy, and imagine what that did to readers who had spent a winter in chainmail. Europe had an established method for dealing with pleasures it could not domesticate. It called them the devils, and then proceeded to borrow them by halves. So cannabis acquired two wardrobes. In one, it was a citizen hemp fields taxed, rope inspected, oil weighed, cloth traded across rivers that froze too late and thawed too early. In the other, it was trouble leaf whispered about. A pipe passed too often in a back room. A boy's laugh during a sermon that made an old woman cross herself and mutter about possession. Officially, all indulgence was suspect. Unofficially, midwives and soldiers and men with ruined knees negotiated exceptions with the plant the way they negotiated them with God humbly in kitchens. Consider a scribe's week. He copies a bishop's tract naming cannabis among temptations that undermine discipline, wine's sly cousin. smoke that makes the mind admire its own reflection. 2 days later, his hand cramps so badly the letters crawl like frightened beetles, and the infirmary rubs a thumb of greenish oil into the muscles until the fist unknots. The sermon is still true, perhaps. So is the thawing of pain. A practical civilization learns to stand with a foot on each boat and call it a bridge. The fear was not groundless. Intoxication blurs duty, and duty was the continent's last defense against weather, war, and want. The church's project order out of appetite depended on mornings that began on time and hands that knew which to string to pull on a bell rope. Parish priests saw what idleness could do without help. They had no appetite for herbs that might give laziness a palatable alibi. If laughter arrived in the nave and stayed to build a house, it could unroof discipline. Better to stamp the seal of suspicion now, while the leaf was still in the basket and not the beaker. Yet daily life ignored edicts the way rivers ignore sermons about dryness. Fishermen mended hemp nets on sunny stoops, tugging knots snug with a rhythm older than the county itself. Millers tied sacks with hemp cord and grew prosperous enough to lend money to men who wrote laws. A weaver declared a bolt finished and trimmed loops with a knife he had ground on a wheel whose axle slept on a lining of hemp tow. The economies of towns were a hymn to the plant's reliability. It would have been impious to pretend otherwise. Into this dependable chorus slipped the small solos of relief. A mason, back screaming from a week on scaffolds, dabbed a line of salve and slept without waking to count sins. An old soldier who'd forgotten how to unclench found his temper softened by a spoon of seed in his soup. A woman who had not wept in a year sat by her hearth after the midwife left, and because the oil made breathing wider, she cried until she could fold the blanket neatly again and put on water for tea. These are not the tales that appear in indictments. They do not thrill inquisitors. They are how people survived themselves. The moral theater grew elaborate. In pulpits, cannabis could star as Pandora's leaf, its sweet promise hiding sloth. In guild halls, hemp was a star without scandal, braided into every proof of honest work. Officials split the difference with a rule as simple as it was impossible to keep clean hemp, yes, intoxication, no. So a bale could be weighed, taxed, and blessed. A pipe, if discovered, could be scolded, fined, or if its owner also owned enemies, named a portal for demons. Europe often writes its laws to match its conscience after the fact, and the conscience here was a quarrel, comfort against control, mercy against fear of the slippery slope. Crusader gossip, like all travel literature, tended to sharpen where home was dull. Tales of Eastern hashish dens were retold in alehouses where men already drank enough to misjudge distances. The exotic served as a scapegoat and spice. The few who experimented with smoke in Europe did so under that double shadow, guilty and theatrical at once, which meant that the plant's quieter uses stayed quieter still. A village that prized discretion learned which doors to knock on for sleep and which for rope. In truth, the medieval mind did not divide the world into medicine and recreation as we do. It asked simpler questions. Does this help me fulfill my station? Does it make me kind when duty tempts me toward cruelty? Does it make my tongue clever when God requires me to be silent? In the Catechism, cannabis, earned both a seat and a warning label. It steadied pain. It tempted idleness. It was a boon to widows and a hazard to boys with too much time. The wiser parishes found a way to keep both truths in their pockets. By the century's end, the plant had done what most humans couldn't, survived everything. Plagues passed, famine leaned hard on larders, lords died like sparks in rain, and still hemp lines stretched across courtyards, still oil lamps burned with a steady, ungossiping light, still apothecaries tapped their scales against the counter and nodded to the next customer. The double life held Europe depended on a plant it pretended to distrust, and distrusted a pleasure it pretended it never felt. What this chapter leaves us with is not a verdict, but a silhouette. In the nave, a priest thundered against leaf-born laughter, and some boy in the back shifted on his feet and remembered the feel of hemp rope in his hands, the honest bite of work. In the lane, a midwife tucked a vial deeper into her bag and kept walking. A continent that wore discipline like a breastplate also wore mercy like a hidden stitch. Hemp was both the visible strap that held the armor and the invisible seam that kept the shirt from tearing under it. The panic would return in other centuries with louder drums and darker prisons. For now, Europe managed its paradox the way we all do, with a sermon in the morning and a salve at night. The oceans open and hemp goes to sea. The plant that tied doors and soothed joints is pressed into salt service, its fibers twisted until they remember only a strength. A ship is a house that moves, and every moving house needs promises that hold under weather. Hemp gives them. It sings in rigging, swells in rain to seal its own weave, snugs knots that sailors name as if they were cousin bowline, clove, sheet bend, carrick little liturgies whisper to calm a storm. Empires will claim they are built on bravery and gunpowder. Listen closer, and you hear the lower note rope. At dawn, naval yards breathe tar and steam. Ropewalks stretch like sentences long, exacting, no wasted words. Boys backstep in rhythm, palms browned by pitch. 4 men test the twist by feel and by ear. The line hums when it's right, complains when it isn't. Farther down the yard, oakum, made of picked hemp, is tamped into hull seams with wooden irons. Hot pitch follows, glossy and decisive. The smell is a covenant. If the sea wants in, it must negotiate. Canvas, its very word, a cousin of cannabis, blooms on spars. Sailcloth is mostly flax in many fleets, but hemp creeps into bolt ropes and reinforcement patches, the small anchors that keep a sail honest when it bellies with wind. Crowns discover what fishermen knew: distance is obedient only to those who can tie it. Orders go out in tidy chancery hands, grow hemp, pay bounties, post inspectors to weigh and grade. On a rainy morning in a northern county, a parish clerk reads the notice to farmers who already know what the soil says. In a New World clearing, a constable passes along a crown's encouragement that feels a shade short of command. The colonies learn a new arithmetic. A row of hemp is a row of coin when the navy comes calling. Ships carry seeds the way pockets carry lint without meaning to, and constantly, the plant rides the wakes that rope made possible. Iberian caravels trail it into the Americas. Portuguese ships leave it in African harbors where monsoon winds barter stories between coasts. Along river banks and mission fields in New Spain, hemp takes root under the same sun that roughens hides and sweetens oranges. Some of it is pure policy: grow fiber for cordage and sacks. Teach techniques, tally output. Some is habit: a friar rubs seed oil into a cracked knuckle. A soldier's wife twists a cord for a jug. Later, in quiet kitchens. The leaf is invited into folk remedies: steeping, poulticing, working in the realm where a plant proves itself by whether a grandmother nods. Across the Atlantic, in the British colonies, statutes and sermons do not always agree, but rope settles arguments by existing. In Virginia and New England, planters put hemp in the ground because a ship in Boston, a frigate in Portsmouth, a merchantman in Bristol will pay for it. A man who distrusts Parliament's taxes will still sell the Navy a coil if the price is fair. In field ledgers, hemp stands beside flax and wheat. In winter accounts, seed oil keeps lamps from sulking. The work is as old as the rope walk and as local as a kitchen comb. Waterette, break, scotch, hackle each verb a hand's apprenticeship. The plant's road does not end at colonial fences north of the Baltic. Whole provinces learn the trick of turning summer into rope. Bales of hemp and tar, bundles of mast and plank leave cold rivers under convoy flags and arrive in British yards as if distance were a habit. When continental wars turn trade lanes into games of chess, the dependence shows its teeth: fleets that sneer at rivals still wait politely for rope. Diplomacy, in those years, smells of hemp and pine, and even the most martial ministers know it. An empire can bluster about a spirit, it must plan for cordage. Sailors do not write treatises, they name things. A good line is kind, a weak one is treacherous. They trust their palms more than proclamations. In a gale off a lee shore, a petty officer runs a hand down a stay and can tell by the grit and give whether his ship will see morning. He does not think about parliaments and quotas. He thinks about fibers remembering their promise. When the wind eases, he rubs a thumbful of grease into the place where the strands had fretted, and the ship thanks him with silence. On another coast, the story picks up different notes. In southern Africa, where old footpaths learned the rhythm of ox wagons and new roads learned the arrogance of forts, cannabis arrives with many names and claims a space. It's not a colonial invention. It rides earlier currents, Indian Ocean traders, inland migrations, and kneels easily into local practice. Under the word daga, it perches at the edge of fields and councils. Men passing a pipe argue less sharply about cattle and boundary stones. Women fold it into remedies that live in the same basket as wild herbs for fevers and teas for stubborn headaches. Later, when magistrates bring ledgers instead of gossip, laws turn their stern faces toward the leaf. Prohibition makes a virtue out of suspicion and pretends not to hear the laughter from kitchen doors, where aunties have managed more delicate balances for decades. Back in the Atlantic, empire codifies its appetite. Statutes promise payments for naval stores, tar pitch, timber, hemp, and the colonies answer with shipments that smell like forests and river mud. Some years the quotas are met, some years they are revised with a wink because drought has opinions too. Inspectors with scales and knives poke bales, slice samples, grumble about tow content, and sign manifests because ships do not wait for perfect rope. In the ledger, hemp is a column of numbers. In the yard, it is a day's work and a week's wage. Language keeps souvenirs. To canvass a question is to treat it like sails spread wide, beat on it with wind, see what it can bear. That verb remembers cloth, whose name remembers a plant. Even line has hemp in its family story. Even tackle does. The ocean wrote these words with spray and salt on men who came ashore and taught their children to say them without thinking of fields at all. If a civilization's vocabulary reveals its spine, this one kept a green fiber running through it like a nerve. Not all the uses are martial or mercantile. In portside rooms were men who have seen too much asleep, too little. A salve warmed in a tin takes the sting out of rope burns and the insult out of old scars. A cooper who has hooped barrels for 20 years dips a rag in seed oil and shows his apprentice how to rub life back into a staves. A printer uses that same oil to make ink flow more obediently on damp mornings. In markets, a seller of small comforts has cakes speckled with toasted seeds that snap between the teeth and chase away the taste of brine. Hemp remains what it has always been, a plant that makes itself useful first and remarkable only after. The authoritarian habit travels with the hemp as faithfully as barn cats. Governors and viceroys write the same memos in different alphabets, compel so many acres, penalize neglect, reward abundance. When war tightens the world's belt, the memos grow urgent. When peace stretches it, the memos tidy themselves and wait. Farmers learn to hear the weather in the tone of these letters. A civil war in one capital becomes a shortage of rope in another. A blockade becomes an incentive. A treaty becomes a warehouse, spilling bundles like loaves. Policy blows hot, then cold. Fields continue to green, then gold, then stubble. Across the Americas, the plant's other life, less official, more domestic threads through places where empire's handwriting thins. In a mountain hamlet, a curandera keeps a jar of oil in a cupboard with saints and salt. Her clients leave with shoulders that lift more easily and instructions to drink water and walk after supper. In a mission infirmary, a brother writes that a bitter infusion quieted a man's spasms. Below the note, he adds the day's psalm, as if to keep the relief in decent company. Somewhere a soldier borrows a pipe from a muleteer and discovers for an evening that laughter can be round rather than sharp. These are not decrees. They are human weather. Meanwhile, the business of empires goes on convoys, letters of marque, prize courts, grain fleets shadowed by frigates, dockyards banging like anvils, visits from officials who smell of starch and anxiety. Rope holds what rhetoric promises. If sails are the visible bravery of a fleet, rigging is its conscience taut where it should be, easing where it must, never showy, always faithful to load and line. Hemp takes the strain with the grace of a worker who has nothing to prove and everything to do. By century's end, the plant has earned a dozen passports without needing any. It is at home in Polish fields lashed by wind, in Ukrainian barns where children nap on redded stalks, in Scottish ropewalks that run true on drizzly afternoons, in Caribbean yards where lines dry fast above water, so blue it looks dishonest. It has learned the language of orders and the dialect of kitchens, the clipped speech of yards and the gossip of alleys. If a governor draws a straight line from hemp to empire, he is not wrong, he is only incomplete. The line runs both ways. A plant capable of holding force together is also capable of holding neighbors together. A rope can moor a ship and also fasten a cradle. The age of sails will pass its oaths to steam and steel. and markets will chase new fibers with the impatience of people who forget how long it took to teach the old ones to behave. But for this long chapter, the world's reach depended on a green stalk that could be persuaded to remember its shape under punishment. You can call that logistics if you like. Sailors called it trust. And when the last watch was set and the deck fell quiet, trust was the sound of lines at rest, no fret, no creak, just the soft breath of a vessel held in place by work done well. The 19th century unlatches a cabinet and finds the plant already waiting inside, bottled and labeled with the caution of an age that loved order. The world has widened steam tugs at rivers, rail lines stitch provinces, telegraphs make distance behave, and with each tightening of the net, ideas slip through bearing new names. Among them, cannabis indica, the Indian preparation that doctors in London and Paris begin writing into their ledgers with the neat confidence of men who think a tincture can be tamed by Latin. Colonial circuits bring more than spices. A young surgeon in Calcutta tests extracts for pain and a spasm and reports, in sentences as dry as a bench, that a few drops calmed convulsions, steadied sleep, soothed pain that had made dignity impossible. In the quiet grammar of medicine, that is a fanfare. The news travels in journals that smell faintly of ink and shipboard damp. Dispensatories add entries almost shyly, as if the herb had been there all along, waiting for a proper introduction. Apothecaries respond the way apothecaries always do. They order stock, argue about strength, and begin to prepare it in the back room where brass scales teach patience. The bottles are brown glass, their labels small sermons, tinct, cannabis indica, ext, cannabis pills of extract in dainty tin rounds shelved between Dover's powders and the formidable army of laudanum. Victorian pharmacies are tidy theaters of relief. Cannabis enters like a character without an obvious scandal. Nurses mark doses for sleeplessness, for neuralgia that bites behind the eyes, for spasmodic affections that modern tongues would rename, but old bodies recognized at once. It is taken by mouth, a bitter rope coiled in alcohol, a few drops turned into a night's reprieve. Doctors praise with restraint useful when opium is too heavy a blanket. Kinder to appetite, less likely to stop a breath, the tincture does not swagger. It suggests. Dosing makes a liar of optimism. Leaf and resin vary from field to field, season to season. The same bottle soothes one patient into grateful silence and hustles another into skittish thought. Extractors learn the plant is like a singer whose voice changes with the room heat, solvent, and time do not always return the same note. Firms with names that now feel like museum labels. Merck, Burroughs, Wellcome, Park Davis attempt tablets and standardized resins, promise regularity in elegant fonts, and discover that the plant keeps a small democracy inside its oils. Physicians adapt, prescriptions grow modest. Begin with a few minims, one advises, and wait. In drawing rooms, the story acquires perfume. Paris in the middle of the century breeds a curiosity that wears velvet and knows its Greek. In a gilded island on the Ile Saint-Louis, a rented salon opens to the Club des Hashishins, writers, painters, doctors who gather monthly to examine the mind with the mind as both subject and instrument. Spoons of greenish jam dawamesque are placed ceremonially on porcelain. A physician times pulses while a poet times metaphors. Eyes widen not in terror but in a study. The talk has a grateful seriousness. What is attention? Exactly. Where does a thought begin? Is sadness a weather pattern or a god? They listen to their own rooms with an attention that feels like prayer and write down whatever returns with them. A physician of this circle decides to make a science out of estrangeness and publishes a treatise marrying hashish and alienation, arguing sometimes gently, sometimes with the zeal of a man who thinks he has found a master key that what the plant induces for hours mimics what illness steals for years. He observes how association quickens, how a single idea crowds a stage, how time grows elastic, how self-regard can become a tyrant. The prose is empirical and theatrical at once, a mashup of case notes and literature. He's not entirely right, but he's not entirely wrong either. And his book becomes a mirror many readers examine their own nights in. Art takes its turn. Painters linger over color that seems to have turned its own volume up a notch. A composer hears a chord hold longer than physics insists. A poet writes a sentence that behaves like a river and calls it an evening's expedition. Some of these reports are self-flattery in a new costume. Some are precise. The best of them admit the cost. A mind that is delighted with itself is a mind in danger of forgetting other people exist. The salons close their doors at a reasonable hour and serve a soup. Across the channel, the Victorians performed their own experiment in respectability. In London and Edinburgh, men with careful whiskers signed their names under case reports that read like postcards from a frontier. An elderly woman whose hands had become claws slept through a storm. A child's seizures shortened. The ache of a soldier's stump unknotted long enough for him to dream without waking shouting. A few even hazard an intimation. Modern ears recognize that the body seems to have its own welcoming mechanisms for this plant's compounds, as if locks waited for keys. They do not yet know the shapes, only that certain doors seem made to open. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, a young American writes a rhapsodic book about his long romance with the drug adventures of appetite and soul, as earnest as a diary and as untrustworthy as any diary written under enchantment. He describes flights no physics permits, despairs that would have made Job nod, ecstasies that make angels look like lousy actors. He is ridiculous and thrilling. The public reads him the way you watch a man lean too far over a balcony. Physicians read him the way you watch weather gathering with curiosity and unease. Underneath the literary chandelier, small practical lights keep burning. Pharmacists instruct patients to let the drops hide in syrup, so bitterness will pass without dramatics. Nurses learn that a teaspoon means nothing if the stock is old. Doctors, forced by their own success with opium to confront its cruelties. Nausea, constipation. Dependents turn gratefully to a medicine that can shorten pain without slamming doors. They write cannab, ind, with a furtive pleasure that looks from 20 paces like hope. Moralists, never unemployed, file their objections. Anything that softens the will is a thief. Anything that pleases too easily is a spy. Legislators begin to talk about poisons in the abstract, the shape of labels, the duty to warn, and the plant that once tucked itself quietly under useful acquires a tiny shadow in a statute. It is not a ban. It is a throat clearing. Behind the counter, apothecaries do what they always do with throat clearings. They keep a stock and nod as if nothing had been said. Science, for its part, learns to make humility look like progress. Chemical glassware grows more elegant. The vocabulary of acids and bases, resins and alkaloids becomes a second alphabet. Men in waistcoats slice a plant's chemistry into compartments and announce each with small triumphs. They can pull out a resin that sits in a spoon like an argument. They can weigh an effect. They can make a pill that looks like obedience. And yet they confess, when pressed, that the thing still behaves like weather. Dose and effect are not a handshake. They are a dance. The era that tamed esteem must live with the fact that the mind is not a piston. In homes, the medicine cabinet democratizes relief. A mother's drawer contains hartshorn, camphor, paregoric, and now a little bottle, a stoppard, stingy that she has been told will help when a night has gone on too long with a child's cough. She uses it as a last resort, not because she fears scandal, but because thrift is a creed. When it works, she says nothing, because nothing is exactly what she was buying: the absence of crying, the absence of pacing, the absence of the helpless anger that shadows love at 3 in the morning. No poet writes that down. The ledger remembers. The century grows older. Fashion, always restless, shifts its interest. Ether parties flirt with danger. Cocaine markets itself like a gentleman. Morphine becomes the house guest who won't leave. Against these louder arrivals, cannabis remains a soft-spoken regular, a modest ally in childbirth wards and sick rooms, a companion to rheumatics, a whisperer to insomniacs. When temperance movements begin to interrogate pleasure as policy, the plant looks innocuous next to the injuries of drink. But simplicity is a liability in politics. Simple things can be repurposed by simple slogans. By century's end, the tincture has achieved what the age loves best: a place on a list. Pharmacopoeias print it with precise a type. Doctors reach for it when they mean kindness. Chemists debate the best way to persuade it into uniformity. In parlors, talk of mind and mood continues to hover around it like perfume. In clinics, talk of dose and indication keeps it honest. It is a good century for the plant and a precarious one. The next will invent gramophones, aeroplanes, moving pictures, and more consequentially, for our leaf, a new appetite for fear disguised as efficiency. For now, the bottle waits on the shelf, its label neat, its contents potent, without a swagger. On the table beside it, a magazine glows with a Parisian's florid account of a night at the Hôtel de Lausanne. Under the table, a nurse's scuffed shoe taps the day's worry out of her foot before she carries the dose down the hall. The salon dreams of the infinite. The infirmary dreams of 4 consecutive hours of sleep for a man who has not had them since his wound. Between them sits a plant that, when asked politely and measured with care, answers in the same voice it has used for millennia: I can help you carry what you must carry. Do not ask me to carry you. The century that loved neat rows and time clocks grew suspicious of anything that arrived as a cloud. Industry wanted standard screws and predictable fuel. Laboratories wanted single molecules in crystal dishes. Parliaments wanted categories that kept their fingers clean. Cannabis, with its old habit of being many things at once, fiber and food. Medicine and merriment began to look like a refugee from an untidy age. Bureaucracy sharpened its pencils. Fear borrowed its voice. In the United States, the word changed first. Ganja and hashish had been the language of apothecaries. The Mexican Revolution sent migrants north with marijuana in their mouths and cigarettes in their pockets. Along the border, sheriffs with new badges and old prejudices found a convenient shorthand: the plant was foreign, which meant it could be blamed for everything that scared them. A headline loves a suspect it can spell in a large type. Newspapers obliged lurid stories about the knife fights and peculiar laughter, smoke that robbed boys of reason, girls of virtue, cities of sleep. The plant had been a neighbor for generations. Under its new name, it became a stranger. Local ordinances sprouted like weeds. El Paso here, New Orleans there, each one criminalizing an hour that had once been unremarkable. In the jazz clubs of Storyville, trumpets learned to lean against the edge of rhythm, while musicians passed a cigarette and found the beat's extra corners. The law, impatient with improvisation, called it degeneracy and sent plainclothes men to prove it. In courtrooms, a single word could tilt a sentence. Marijuana sounded guilty even before anyone spoke. At the federal level, a man found his crusade. Harry Anslinger, head of the new Federal Bureau of Narcotics, needed a monster to justify his budget: cannabis, with its strange syllables and crowded history, could be simplified into one-story menace. He toured the country, gathering affidavits like a traveling priest collecting sins, most of them hearsay, many of them soaked in racism and class panic. The press offered him a pulpit. He offered the press a villain whose smoke could be filmed. In 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, couched in the gray vocabulary of stamps and registries, but designed to make ordinary possession a bureaucratic trap. Doctors protested, the law nodded and carried on. The plant shifted overnight from pharmacy to file cabinet, and then to evidence locker. The irony arrived a few years later wearing a khaki uniform, war-strained supply chains until even prejudice had to share. The Navy needed rope, the Army needed webbing, the nation needed cordage that came from the soil instead of siegeable factories. The Department of Agriculture released a film, Hemp for Victory, and Midwestern fields turned green with a crop the same government had just made unsayable. Boys who had never seen the ocean twisted stalks into line and learned, for one summer at least, to call the plant a patriot. When victory came, the old suspicion returned as if the concession had been a daydream. The film went missing. The fields went fallow. The word went back to the docket. Internationally, prohibition acquired a passport. Treaties that had once wrangled over opium widened to include cannabis. Committees met in rooms with flags and ashtrays and declared what nations must forbid to be considered modern. The Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961 formalized the plant's exile with the kind of administrative finality only a conference can muster. Latin footnotes sprouted in law codes from Cairo to Caracas. Prohibition traveled not on moral certainty alone, but on paperwork, a fact that made it both efficient and, over time, absurd. Meanwhile, science kept reading in dim light. A handful of chemists chased the plant's active voices along glassware and heat, pulling out resins that could be weighed and named, arguing over which fraction did what. Doctors still reached for cannabis when a patient's pain made sleep a negotiation, and opiates were too heavy a hand, but the legal fog thickened. Pharmacopoeias pruned their entries. A medicine that had been ordinary became awkward to prescribe in hospitals where practicality usually beats policy. A new caution crept in better to avoid the trouble, even if the patient's night grew longer. By mid-century, the fever for order turned punitive. Congress reached for speeches and came back with shackles, the Boggs Act, the Narcotics Control Act, setting mandatory minimums that treated substances as if they had intent. Police found in the new statutes an easier way to measure success arrests, tallied like harvests. The numbers looked good on paper. Neighborhoods learned they meant fathers missing at supper and sons learning fear's geography. The drug's danger did not confine itself to veins and lungs. It colonized sentences and budgets. Culture, untidy as ever, refused to match the memo. The beat poet rolled cigarettes and stared at typewriters until the line turned to jazz. College lawns filled with students who discovered that a plant could loosen thought from heedless conformity. The decade's word was experiment. And the plant, as always, offered to be a mild assistant if asked politely and a mischievous saboteur if not. The dusk between curiosity and carelessness filled with music. Policymakers watched the long hair and decided the leaf was to blame for the politics attached to it. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act gave the plant a new cell, Schedule I, the box reserved for the dangerous and medically useless. The president convened a commission whose sober conclusion that personal use should not be a crime was shelved like an inconvenient book. A war on an abstraction requires trophies. Cannabis arrests supplied them by the truckload. Campaigns taught children to say no. Budgets taught police to say yes to grants that counted seizures like victories. The decade's grammar paired drugs with crime so often that the words learned to finish each other's sentences. In the 1980s, austerity learned to dress like virtue. Mandatory minimums hardened. Civil asset forfeiture allowed the estate to seize property on suspicion. Television married fear to ratings and set them both on the coffee table. The leaf's danger became less chemical than social. A young man with a joint in his pocket could stumble into a machine designed to measure not harm, but compliance. Communities learned what law had always known, but rarely admitted, that punishment clusters where resources are thin and skin is dark. Two teenagers on two sides of a city made the same mistake. One received a lesson, the other a record. Beneath the headlines, private life kept practicing its quiet heresies. A cancer patient found that a few puffs nursed appetite back from exile when treatment turned food into a stranger. A veteran whose nights were loud with memory discovered the smoke turned volume down without extinguishing the lamp. A grandmother, indignant at the notion of criminality, baked a batch of cookies that made her friend's hands stop shaking long enough to thread a needle and feel like herself. None of these scenes altered policy. All of them conspired to alter private convictions about what was moral. Industry moved on without waiting for law to tidy its contradictions. Nylon recruited sailors. Polypropylene wooed ropewalks. Oil found uses for every bright fraction of itself. Hemp, demoted for suspicion it had not earned, waited at the fence row like a reliable old worker quietly let go. A few agronomists muttered that the fiber still had work to do. A few activists insisted the plant had been scapegoated to protect other interests. A few conspiracy theories, lush as vines, wrapped themselves around names like Hearst and DuPont. The truth, less cinematic, was that fashion, fear, and convenience formed a clique and did not invite hemp to their parties, and yet science, finally given better tools, returned to the plant like a detective who has been worrying the same case for years. In a small lab, a glass flask revealed a particular voice, one molecule with outsized influence, then others that spoke in counterpoint, in animals, in the slices of tissue, in the delicate theater of the synapse. Receptors flickered like doorbells wired for a signal the plant knew how to ring. The body, it turned out, owned its own cannabis cannabinoids braided into normal housekeeping. The plant was less an intruder than a traveling cousin. Facts like these take years to fight their way through politics. They began their march. By the 1990s, another contradiction forced itself into daylight. Patients with AIDS, gaunt and nauseated, testified that the plant made it possible to eat. Parents of children with intractable seizures tried everything and then tried this and watched, amazed and terrified of hope. As the storms eased, a state ballot asked a practical question: if a doctor says this helps, why must a patient be a criminal to accept it? Voters answered with an old civic shrug: because we are not cruel. The law shuddered, then began to redraw itself in pencil instead of pen. But that is the next chapter. This one ends in a muddle, which is to say, in history's natural key. A bottle on a Victorian shelf had promised order. A century of paperwork delivered a labyrinth. Within it, lives continued broken, mended, ordinary, brave. The plant did what it has always done, waited to be asked the right question in the right room. When that happened, quietly, relief followed. When it didn't, panic found a camera and made a speech. Between those poles lay millions of evenings, most of them unremarkable, some of them unjustly remarkable. All of them braided into the long rope we pretend is a straight line. The pencils that redrew the map in the 1990s did not press hard. They sketched. First a state here, a city there, if a physician says this helps. Let a card in a pocket be permission instead of peril. A green cross began to appear in windows, half pharmacy, half promise. And behind the counter, a quiet revolution resumed its old work. The plant came back to the sick room as if returning from a long exile, head down, ready to be useful again. Science, no respecter of campaigns, kept asking its precise questions. In small rooms full of glassware and patients, researchers followed the plant's voice into the body and found an echo already waiting there. Receptors appeared like doorbells, one abundant in the brain, another attentive in immune tissues and molecules. Our own cells rang them with tidy efficiency. Someone named a lipid anandamide, borrowing a Sanskrit word for bliss, not to be poetic, but because the effect warranted the grin. The lesson was homelier than the headlines. The body owns a system for tuning appetite, pain, memory, mood. The plant speaks a dialect that system understands. With that translation book open, medicine revisited old ground with better maps. Spasticity eased in patients whose muscles had learned to clench like fists. Nausea relented enough to let calories count. Pain that made nights punitive softened without the stone weight of opiates. A few disorders, stubborn and cruel to children, answered with a startling generosity when carefully measured oils found their way past clenched storms. Labels, sprays, capsules, standardized extracts learned to behave like medicine, even as the legal thicket around them continued to behave like politics. Law moved like weather. Voters approved compassion in one jurisdiction, while legislators elsewhere rehearsed old thunder about menace. Courts in some countries recognized a right to quiet use where it harms no one. Parliaments in others preferred the comfort of prohibition's blunt line. A handful of nations changed the conversation entirely. No longer is this permitted, but how shall we regulate the ordinary, and discovered the difficulty of being the first to tell an industry how to grow without forgetting the people it had harmed on the way here. Policies wobbled, amendments arrived, pilot programs learned their lessons in public. Meanwhile, the market did what markets do, it ran ahead. After one farm bill disentangled hemp from its scandalous sibling by fiat of a percentage, fields filled with fiber again and, more noisily, with the non-intoxicating molecule that became a craze. Cannabidiol slipped into coffee, pet treats, bath salts, and prayer. Some bottles were honest, some were air inexpensive costumes. Trust learned to insist on lab reports and batch numbers. A generation that had learned to read food labels now learned to read chromatograms. In the margins, synthetics and semi-synthetics darted through loopholes, new isomers, new acronyms proving, once again, that law does not like to sprint. The return of legality also brought abundance, and abundance brought potency. Flowers fat with resin replaced the mild, seedy leaf of old stories. Concentrates turned the plant into amber lightning and taught a verb dab that arrived with both devotion and nose wrinkles. Public health found its voice again. Go low, go slow. Edibles walk, they don't run. A chocolate square is not a dare. Keep it locked as you would bleach. Do not drive. If your family carries a history that worries you, proceed with extra caution. If panic visits, breathe, sip water, wait. Doctors remembered to say both things at once. This can help and this can harm. The line is dose, age, context, constitution, equity. For a time, only a word in speeches fought its way onto paper. If a war on the plant had been, often enough, a war on neighborhoods, then the peace had to include repairs, expungement of old records, first rights to licenses for those most punished, loans that did not require miracles, taxes that funded communities rather than only treasuries. The ideas were better than their implementation. Bureaucracy, still loving tidy forms, proved a poor negotiator with grief that arrived in stories. Some jurisdictions rose to the occasion. Others gestured at justice and delivered paperwork. The plant, convenient scapegoat for decades, discovered it was an inconvenient teacher when it asked institutions to be brave. Culture changed its tone, almost shyly. Grandparents who had inhaled in college and then spent a lifetime pretending not to remember how to sleep. Veterans who had learned to fear the ambush of memory found a dial they could turn without turning themselves off. Artists came back not to worship, but to work the same way writers had once used coffee, or composers a walk at dusk. The old romance between leaf and music donned contemporary clothes playlists, careful devices that smell less like fire, living rooms where laughter is rounder than the arguments on the screens. On other nights, the plant misbehaved because people did. A teenager discovered that potency and puberty make poor companions. Teachers practiced the difficult art of distinguishing rebellion from self-medication. A parent left a gummy where small hands could find it and learned the terrors of an unnecessary ambulance ride. In one season, illicit oils cut with something they should never have met tore at lungs and reminded everyone that regulation is not only nosiness, it is the habit of checking that what's in the bottle matches the label. The old rule proportion, prudence, patience returns with its sleeves rolled. The industry learned the meaning of mature the hard way. Early stores felt like apothecaries run by enthusiastic cousins. Later ones learned to be boring in the best sense labels with sensible fonts. Staff who ask about what you're trying to accomplish. Products that list ratios and testing labs instead of a swagger. Artisan growers spoke the language of soil and terpenes and made a case that aroma is not mere perfume, but part of how the plant sings. Large firms spoke the language of supply chains and recalled that consistency is a kind of kindness. Somewhere between those poles, the orchard and the factory consumers learned their own preferences and their own limits. Global maps kept revising themselves. One small country on the Atlantic said yes first and proved the sky did not fall. A larger neighbor did so with fanfare and discovered both the thrill and the tedium of being a pioneer. Courts on one continent recognized private gardeners. Ministries on another allowed clubs instead of shops. Some governments decriminalized with a shrug. Others doubled down with a frown. In certain places, policy whiplashed liberal one year, stern the next, because politics enjoys performance more than implementation. Through it all, the plant did what it has always done. When humans argue about it, it grew. In clinics, humility persisted. Not every pain yields, not every mind steadies. Tolerance accumulates. Dependence visits some houses uninvited. The best physicians kept the plant as a tool in a wider kit movement. Sleep hygiene, talk, diet, sunlight, medicine when needed. Patients always. They rode dozing like carpenters, measure beams twice, then cut. They asked their patients to keep diaries, to notice what else changed the same day: a walk, a fight, a forgotten lunch, so causation did not turn arrogant. The law's last frontier, as ever, was the road. Breathalyzers love alcohol because it behaves like math. Cannabis behaves like memory lingering, unhelpful when officers want numbers. Legislatures experimented with per-essay limits that comforted lawyers and baffled pharmacologists. Better tests were promised. In the meantime, the old rule had to suffice: impairment is the thing, not presence. Juries relearned common sense, drivers relearned restraint. If the earlier centuries gave the plant a few clear costumes: rope, remedy, ritual, this one insisted on a closet. It can be a medicine in a child's spoon and a vice in a bored adult's evening. An industry that pays mortgages and a loophole that hustles labels into nonsense. A relief, a risk, a revenue stream, a research question. The mature stance is not adoration or denunciation. It is neighborliness with boundaries, which is to say the long arc has not bent toward a verdict so much as toward proportion. The plant that once traveled with caravans now travels with compliance officers and lab techs. The incense that once hung in tents now exits a vaporizer in a rented apartment where the lease forbids smoke. In that apartment, someone with a careful job and an anxious brain measures a tincture stirs tea, and writes an email later that is kinder than it would have been. Down the hall, another person decides not to, because tomorrow morning is important. The plant remains what it has always been in its best chapters, an assistant, not a master, a companion, not a creed. We are nearly at the end of our walk, which means back where we began, a plant, a fire, a human asking for a small change in weather. The modern wardrobe is louder, the rules more baroque, the vocabulary crowded with acronyms. But when all that fades, the scene is familiar preparation, intention, dose, patience. The great surprise of the present is not that the plant has become ordinary again. It is that we have begun haltingly to behave as if we remember how to be ordinary with it. If we have been walking all this time to answer a child's sly question, when did people start smoking weed? The honest reply is not a date, but a scene. A hand opens a door flap into a felt tent. A seed sizzles on hot stones. Someone breathes, then says a name softly so the dead feel welcome. Or it is a temple courtyard where a pestle turns leaf to green milk, and a vigil becomes endurable. Or a small brazier in a cave where a monk measures vapor like a sentence, and the sentence teaches him to listen. The first smoke is not rebellion, it is architecture, the building of a room inside the body where grief and attention can sit without quarreling. The date is as early as the need. From there, the plant learned to travel by doing favors. It offered rope before it offered vision lines that held ships against the persuading hand of tide. It offered paper and lamp oil and sandals that did not sulk in rain. It walked with priests not because it wanted to be holy, but because priests wanted reliable helpers in rooms where breath made the roof. It learned the customs of Persia's night schools and Cairo's courtyards. It learned the discipline of mountains where rumors tried to replace logistics. It learned Europe's double life hymn in the morning, salve at night so well that its fiber still explains how wooden worlds crossed salt water. When people asked for steadiness, it was rope. When people asked for softness, it was a smoke. The plant's genius has always been hospitality. Centuries later, we renamed the hospitality danger and wrote laws like hedges around it. Some were drawn from honest caution. Our minds are precious and easy to flatter. Our duties are fragile and easy to flee. Others were drawn from fear that wore a sheriff's badge or a bureaucrat's grin. We clapped the leaf in irons by renaming it foreign, then begged it back into the fields when war taught us logistics again. We said no so loudly in one decade that the next had to rediscover how to whisper, perhaps to the sick, without being accused of treachery. If the story stumbles here, it is because we do a species that loves both order and relief, has always argued with itself about the thermostat. Modern rooms look cleaner but hold the same questions. A bottle on a nightstand, an eyedropper, a halved chocolate esquire in a tin with a child-proof lid, a label with numbers that mean patience if you read them correctly. We have given our caution new vocabulary ratios, receptors, impairment, and our confidence, new rituals lab reports, batch codes, locks. We tell each other new proverbs that are only the old ones dressed for town. Go low, go slow. Do not ask a tool to be a creed. Keep joy close to responsibility, and they will watch each other's behavior. When it goes wrong, it tends to be our errors trying on the plant's coat. We mistake a doorbell for the whole house. We forget that tomorrow morning is a country with a strict border policy, and yet, in one apartment, a woman who has not slept through a week's worth of nights measures a tincture, sets a timer, and discovers that 4 hours can be a miracle. In another, a veteran whose memories ambush him like weather finds that smoke is small. Respectful turns down the volume without erasing the song. In a third, a painter listens to a color a little longer and realizes the canvas was asking for restraint, not bravado. None of these scenes will make headlines. They are the plant's favorite room ordinary kindness. What has changed beneath the paperwork is our honesty about the body. We have found in our own cells the locks that the plant's keys fit a housekeeping system that tunes hunger, mood, and pain like strings on a lute. We do not need poetry to sanctify it. We need proportion. The plant's voice is loud in some throats, quiet in others. It arrives as velvet to one and as static to another. The lesson is embarrassingly old-fashioned mind your dose. Mind your age, mind your family's weather. There's no nobility in pretending you are not like your uncle when your uncle taught you everything you know about your own mood. Policy, the art of turning quarrels into paragraphs, will keep revising itself. Some places will decide the best way to make harm small is to keep the plant illegal and trust fear. Others will decide that harm shrinks when you bring it into daylight, make labels legible, and punish the behaviors that actually break bones: reckless driving, neglect, deceit. Between those poles lie long town meetings and short tempers. The plant will sit like a quiet witness to our strategies, growing in ditches and laboratories with the same lack of interest in our rhetoric. It has had 5,000 years to practice patience. In the quieter corners of the present, hemp, the humble muscle of the story, has again started to lift. Farmers who like crops that forgive weather and return carbon to soil have walked their fields nodding to stalks they recognize from their grandparents' mouths. Rope has new rivals, but fiber still finds work in composites that lighten cars, in panels that insulate without sulking in damp, in paper that remembers forests with gratitude. In another cupboard, oil waits its place among ordinary pantry mercies, savory and nutty, and good for frying potatoes, on a night when sorrow needs an excuse to gather the family around one pan. The plant prefers the work that earns only a satisfied shrug. We are not finished blaming it for our own mismanners. Teenagers will still test its strongest clothes on the weakest days of their brains. Companies will pivot from exuberance to cynicism and back, selling promises that chemistry can't keep. Lawmakers will write limits that try to make breath behave like math. That is another way of saying we are human, and this plant is close to us, close enough to be a scapegoat, close enough to be a friend, close enough to remind us that most moral questions are logistics with feelings. What endures from the earliest rooms is the choreography, preparation, intention, dose, patience, the felt tent where the dead are welcome, the courtyard pestle that turns leaf to companionship, the cave brazier that warms attention until it hums, the rope walk where fibers are taught to remember their shape under punishment. Each is a form that teaches the same courtesy. Do not rush, do not boast, do not forget why you came. When the plant appears in its worst stories, that courtesy has failed. When it appears in its best, the courtesy is the whole story. So when did people start smoking weed? When they discovered breath could carry more than oxygen, grief, praise, a promise to be gentler by morning. When did they start fearing it? When they discovered ease can make duty look smaller than it is. When did they start trusting it again? Whenever a night grew longer than a sermon and a measured kindness kept a house from breaking itself in the dark. The timeline looks like an argument. The argument looks like a family. The family looks like us. If you stand at the door to this long house and look back, you can still see every room lit at once. The Scythian tent flickering like a hearth beneath a sky so big it teaches humility. The Indian courtyard where bhang cools a vigil into wisdom. The Chinese cave where a smoke writes a single careful character in the air. The Persian hall with high windows and a fire that remembers your face. The Cairo den that is more library than lair. The mountain fortress that traded legends for logistics. The European ropewalk where boys backstep a sentence they could recite in their sleep. The Victorian infirmary where a nurse closes a door and lets the tincture do its small, honest shift work. The ballot line where a city says, as politely as it can, we choose compassion. The plant passes from room to room, not as a hero or a villain, but as a tool that keeps learning the furniture. Tonight, we close the door we opened at the beginning and let the house return to its own breathing. The fan turns. The street is quieter than it was an hour ago. If you use the plant, use it like a guest who deserves good manners, fed, measured, thanked, and sent to bed at a decent hour. If you do not, the story is still yours, because it is the story of how people have tried to carry being alive without dropping it. Rope, smoke, oil, paper, each an answer to the same question. How can we hold together what weather and time are always trying to pull apart? Good night. May your room be the right size for your thoughts. May your breath remember its work. May the past, for once, be only a lullaby